Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings event list analysis. Today we'll be looking at all of the lists that have been submitted for CanCon, which will be happening at the end of this month in Canberra, Australia. This event will be a Worlds qualifier, it's an official Parabellum event, and it's very much a meeting of metas style event, which makes list analysis for it particularly interesting. Australia has a large Conquest community, but it's spread out geographically across the eastern seaboard and western seaboard. And those local metas tend to develop with their own influences and ideas about what is strong in the game. You will see some common themes, but there is a lot on display in the CanCon lists, and very little in the way of an obvious and concrete meta, which makes looking at how these different lists might perform very interesting. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be doing each faction's lists grouped together, talking about each list and what we expect it to be able to do, what we think its strengths and weaknesses are, and we'll give it a rating out of 5. This is a very approximate assessment of how many games I think it's going to be able to reliably win at CanCon, and I will almost certainly be wrong in every case because in Conquest it's very much not the list, it's the player that wins games. Still, we're going to do a little bit of an assessment of the list's power, uniqueness, individuality, what it's going to be bringing to the table, and how well, in a neutral environment, I think it might be able to do. Timestamps will be in the video below, so if there's a particular faction that interests you, you can just jump around. And we're going to start with city-states. In terms of presence at CanCon, City-States is the second least popular faction, with only 100 kingdoms having fewer players. There are 2 players playing City-States at CanCon. This one is list submitted by Michael Martin, and it's an Aristarch Warlord list, but it begins with a Polemarch. The Polemarch himself has Atlantis Spear, Inscription of Lighter Alloys, and Architects 3, and he'll be fighting in an Agema unit, which is 5-strong Agema unit with a Hyparchos. There's also a unit of 3 Minotaur Haspists, 3 Saturoi with a Satyr Assassin, and 3 Selenoi, so 1 ranged, 1 melee goats. The Aristarch has the Primodynamic Globe and Architects 1, and he'll be fighting in a unit of 6 Hoplites, which does include a Minotaur Haspist and a Dolorelates. The Aristarch's warband also includes a minimum unit of Minotaur Thyrians, and then we have a single regiment warband with an Eidolon, who'll be fighting in a unit of 4 Thorakides, which includes both a Hyparchos and a Minotaur Therian auxiliary. This list may be familiar to people who've watched this channel before, because Michael is a Canberra local, and this is a list that he's been working on slowly over time. The list is designed to play a mix of city-state style hammer and anvil, but it's not exclusively built around that. It's also built around mobility and fluidity with quite a large number of fluid formation units. So the Aristarch's regiment with the hoplites will play around with like the Minotaur Thyrians, a functional hammer and anvil style play, while the rest of the list plays in a much more versatile kind of way. The Saturoi exert pressure on the rear, the Selenoi are a light skirmisher unit, and then we have Agema and Thorakides both being actually quite dangerous because the Thorakides will be buffed up by the Minotaur Thyrian and the Eidolon or the Inquisitor Eidolon, giving it quite a lot of both scoring potential and melee power because the Eidolon is a real beater in melee. Michael has been learning to play this list over time, and particularly over about the last month, he's gotten quite good at using the different layered defenses the list can do. Something that's not immediately apparent about this list is that the Polemarch, Aristarch, and Eidolon all offer different but quite powerful defensive buffs to the big units that they're in. The Eidolon can offer parry, the Aristarch can offer defense rerolls of 6, and the Polemarch can force your opponent to reroll ranged attack rolls of 1 against the regiment. And what this means is that if this list can match its defenses into your opponent's offenses, then it can perform very well. For example, in a recent game playing against my Spires list, the Aristarch with its defense for hoplites rerolling 6s managed to match up against an Aura of Death unit and almost completely nullify Aura of Death damage. The Polemarch's unit was facing down a ranged unit with Rapid Shot and was able to force rerolls of those valuable rolls of 1 to be rerolled. And then the Thorakides were just fighting in melee, making excellent use of parry, which is a very strong melee-only defensive ability. So broadly, this list has quite a lot of potential, but it is challenging to play. Like most city-states lists, it's also honestly probably about 5% overcosted, just from some pieces in city-states being a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of power. City-states are probably the weakest faction in Conquest right now, not by a massive margin, but a 2,000 point city-states list kind of feels like a 1,900 point list of anything else. For that reason, I'm going to say this list is probably a 2 out of 5, with the caveat that by the time we come to February 8th and we get some changes to factions, it's almost certain that city-states will receive some love in that update, which I think will shoot this kind of list up. It's very much a have your cake and eat it too style city-states list, which I really like. I think Michael will do pretty well with this, but this is his first event, and city-states generally are a challenge to play at the moment. They apparently perform very well if you're very, very good at the game, but any list performs very well if you're very, very good at the game. So we're giving this one a 2 out of 5. Not as a consequence of the player, just as a consequence of it's very good, it has some very interesting ideas going on, but city-states are tough to play. Our second city-states list, submitted by Dean Hollis, has a lot of similar themes going on, but it's a Polemarch Warlord list. Now, the Polemarch Warlord is probably better than the Aristarch Warlord for city-states, not in the sense that it is more dynamic, it doesn't necessarily have more applications, but it is just a solid and powerful buff. It makes the unit that the Polemarch is in very good and very reliable and more durable, and for that reason, particularly if you are playing a 5-round event and you need to spare some mental energy to play all 5 of those games and still get to round 5 with some gas in the tank, the Polemarch is probably a better choice. In this list, we have a Polemarch Warlord with Atlantis Spear, Inscription of Light Alloys, and Architects 2, not Architects 3, so the full wombo combo of impacts off of the strategic stack doesn't necessarily exist, but you have to cut points somewhere to afford everything, and he will most likely be fighting, in fact he will be fighting, in a unit of 4 Agema with a Hipparchos. So this is a smaller Agema unit, not necessarily making maximal use of the Polemarch's buffs, but certainly it's enough to do a great deal of damage from downtown with that fluid formation lighter alloys yeet across the table. We have a lot of Minotaurs filling out this combat group. Warband, we have 1 unit of Minotaur Haspis and 2 units of Minotaur Therians. Our second warband is an Eidolon. He's paid for Hephaestian alloys here, which is kind of a quality of life thing. If you are looking to manage specific matchups, for example, say someone is playing a bunch of Force-Grown Drones with Aura of Death, then this is a piece that will let you have some tech into that, but it is an expensive upgrade that could potentially have been Architects 3 on the Polemarch Warlord. Now, the Eidolon here can be playing in one of 2 possible regiments. He can join either the Thorakides with Hipparchos and Minotaur Therian Auxiliary, or he could join the Auxiliary, or he could join the Inquisitors. My guess is that he will join the Thorakides because he makes them scoring and adds another combat stand to the Thorakides. But this could go either way, and it'll be interesting to see what Dean chooses to do here. Again, my guess though is the Thorakides. It's an expensive regiment, but an Eidolon in Thorakides is early game power that it's otherwise difficult to exert with city-states. Inquisitors are slightly overcosted, but they are still dangerous, and if they manage to get lined up and get that charge, they will do a great deal of damage. Rather than another Aristarch, like we would see in Michael's list, here we have a second Polemarch. Polemarchs are the more dangerous of the 2 characters, and he is in a big, chungus, 6-strong unit of hoplites. Now, this isn't the largest possible unit of hoplites you can see. It's still relatively classic to see in some city-states lists up to 8 plus a Polemarch. 6 is more of a happy medium, but it does have the Minotaur Haspis and the Dorolates. This kind of unit is going to be relatively necessary just because you have all of these 2 units of Minotaur Therians plus the Inquisitors. You have hammers that are dying for an anvil. So this list has 1 very solid anvil. It will be slightly less durable than an Aristarch-led unit of hoplites because the Aristarch gives that pseudo untouchable, but the Polemarch is just much more dangerous. This one has a Primodynamic Globe, Architects 2, and the Blade of Achades. So with Flawless Strikes and the buff from the Dorolates, which I believe will give Relentless Blows to the Polemarch, plus Flurry, you can get potentially a lot of damage just out of the auxiliary stance and character. So the Polemarch means this is a killier regiment, and that's totally serviceable. Also, frankly, I imagine this is going to be at least partially decided by what Dean has painted. That's another thing that will influence lists in Conquest. There are going to be at least some lists that we will see today that I know are a compromise to the painting requirement. Not many, but almost certainly some. So in comparison to our first city-states list that we saw, this list is less techy and more direct. It has multiple units of dangerous brutes, and it's getting those by having fewer things like Saturoi. I think in a 5-round event, that is probably going to favor this player. There is less mental weight that's on them to do things like manage the Selenoi and especially the Saturoi. which are an extremely strong unit but complex to play. And for that reason, I'm inclined to give this like a 2.25 out of 5. It shares a lot of the same strengths. It's a list that I think is good but will be better in a month's time. However, with a good player that understands them, that on paper ranking that I am choosing to give this list can easily be exceeded. If someone tells me that Dean has gone 3, 4, or even won the event, I won't be surprised because there is the potential in this list. It's just challenging, and you have to play on point consistently for not just the entire game, but the entire event to get the most out of it. Nevertheless, things like fluid formation, and Inscription of Lighter Alloys give you big playmaking potential, so if you're on point, this list can do really well, and I'm very interested to see how Dean goes. Those were our only two city-states lists, which means in alphabetical order, moving on, we're now going to have a look at Dweghom. So there were 4 Dweghom lists at time of recording submitted for CanCon, and something particularly interesting is that we are bucking what I had expected to be a trend, and there is a mix of different creeds. There are 2 Tempered Creed lists, 1 Ardent Creed list, and 1 Creedless list, which is actually considerably surprising because even now with multiple changes to Dweghom that have happened over the course of 2023, there is still a general consensus that the Tempered Creed is probably the strongest. But these lists, especially the Ardent Creed one, which is very interesting, are making full attempts to maximize the different creeds and different options that are available. And we'll see Tempered Creed. There are 2 of those. They're very solid and very useful and very powerful lists. But the Dweghom players attending CanCon are definitely trying to do different things rather than being pigeonholed into what you might conceive of as the basic meta. So the first of these 2 lists is one of our Tempered Creed lists, and it's Tom Nash from CanCon's Dweghom list. This list might also be familiar to viewers of the channel because I've played against this or something like it many times. Tom is a very good local Dweghom player, and this list is something that he's been honing over the course of the last couple of months. It's led by a Tempered Sorcerer on Hellbringer Warlord with Fire School. Tom has previously tried to get the Chthonic Flame onto him, but it's had to be cut just to make some space in this list for other things, which is using its points very efficiently. We have a naked unit of Hold Warriors with nothing special. We have a Hellbringer Drake, and that's the entirety of this first warband. The Hold Warriors are kind of a downgrade points-wise from Ballistae, but this list has plenty of ranged units, and those Hold Warriors provide kind of just an essential holding element. They just add an extra medium reserve roll, and they can run onto an objective late in the game and just sit there. Those kind of pieces are things that I don't want lots of in a list, but just a couple is really useful, and the Hold Warriors pick is I'm talking about like you took a basic medium mainstay, go for you. But it's a evolution of the list that Tom's been working on for some time, and I think it's very subtle and clever. We then have a second Tempered Sorcerer. This one is Magma School. It'll be fighting in a unit of Hold Ballistae, and the rest of his warband is 1 minimum unit of Inferno Automata. We then have a Tempered Steel Shaper, who'll be fighting in a unit of 3 Hold Ballistae, and he's bringing along 4 Steel Forged. Then we have a Hold Rag with just Tactical 1 in a unit of 4 Hold Thanes with the Herald of Fire and an Ironclad Drake. So there are 4 full warbands and 4 characters in this list, 2 heavy regiments, 3 ranged regiments, and just a real mix of high quality, light, medium, and heavy units. How this list plays is that it's a very effective token farm. Ideally, 2 spellcasters, and most of the time, 2 spellcasters will arrive on the field on the first turn, and both of them will be able to begin generating tempered tokens from the first turn. The Magma Sorcerer will just throw out his terrain piece or make terrain erupting, and the Tempered Sorcerer will just autocast any of his 1 spells that can target his unit. This begins to generate a large pool of tokens from the early game, which then can be committed decisively. And that allows the rest of the list to play in the knowledge that there is a cushion in case something begins to go wrong. Among other things, this makes running the 4-strong unit of Steelforged quite safe. 4 as a unit size, unless the unit is very durable, 4 is a risky unit size because it only takes you 3 casualties to break and shatter the regiment in a turn. Now, Steelforged are very durable, and Steelforged with tempered tokens behind them are especially durable. So you can run those 4 Steelforged, just get that extra punch and wounds, and you get that little bit of extra stuff in the list, and it's that 4th Steelforge that Tom has paid for by doing things like trimming down a unit of Fireforged into Hold Ballistae, trimming down some banners, trimming Chthonic Flame, that kind of thing. Also of note is the decision to put Herald of Fire on the Hold Thanes. Herald of Fire is an expensive but good attachment just by itself. It will give the regiment +1 attack. We can see those Hold Thanes have 5 attacks. But the main thing that it does is it lets that Fire Warlord on the Drake blast into units that are engaging the Hold Thanes. Tom has gotten very good at using this cleverly, essentially, to do a number of useful things. The first thing is it means that you are almost always likely, or you're more likely to be able to get your spells off with the Fire Sorcerer, which is important because you have to be casting those spells to generate tokens. So just having access to a second way to get those spells cast, when you can otherwise, you can starve out the Fire Sorcerer by just staying away from him, that's important. Secondly, it means the Fire Sorcerer can contribute force to 2 different parts of the table. He projects a huge aura of danger around himself with the Hellbringer's range attacks and his spells, but then he also can project force to the Thanes, who can be on a different side of the table, meaning that a small relative footprint can be not necessarily guaranteed to win, but if necessary, those Thanes can be reinforced by the Fire Sorcerer Warlord without anyone actually being anywhere near them. In total, what that means is that this is a list between the Inferno Automata and the Ballistae, has excellent early game units. With the Steelforged and the Hellbringer, it has incredible mid game units. By the way, those will usually play together. The Steelforged will form a line with the Hellbringer behind them. The 2 units are fast enough to piggyback one another if they need to. It's a terrifying, terrifying formation to have to fight. And then in the late game, excellent quality heavies, including the superlative Ironclad Drake, possibly one of the best heavies for its points cost in the game. It outperforms Dragon Slayers in most circumstances. It's just very strong. I think this list has the potential to go the distance. We're going to give this list a 4 out of 5. It's doing everything that Dweghom wants to do well, with relatively few compromises. It is an excellent combined arms list, and I can personally speak for its strength. Our second Dweghom list is our Ardent Creed list, being played by Cameron Norton, another local Canberra player, so I have played against this list a few times as well. Now, contextually speaking, mad props to Cameron just generally. Conquest is Cameron's first wargame. He has not come into wargaming through the usual 40k pipeline, to my knowledge. He just picked up Conquest, like out of the blue, and has beavered away at learning how this weird hobby that we have works. It has been really, really incredible to watch him just figure everything out, basically from first principles, and he is determined to do so, which has been wonderful to watch. He has, from the sort of very beginning, he's been against the idea of going with this crowd and playing Tempered Creed, particularly when Tempered Creed was very, very strong in 2023, and he's really fallen in love with the Ardent Kerouac Warlord and the Ardent Creed. Now, if you haven't played against it, the Ardent Creed does a couple of things. It rallies all of your units automatically should they break, and it gives every command stand +2 attacks. The Ardent himself has a Supremacy ability, but it's almost irrelevant compared to unlocking the Ardent Creed. The downside of the Ardent Creed is that you can't play the Tempered Creed, which is very strong, but by itself it's still very, very good. And the effect it has is you have a real, almost Nord style, good to the last drop series of units. Every command stand is more dangerous, and if your regiment gets like punched and knocked all the way down to the command stand, you will still be able to inspire and clash back because you have that automatic rallying effect from the Ardent Creed. Now, the list that Cameron has been working on, I think he still wants to change this, and there's a good chance he will actually ask the list or the tournament organizers if he can make changes. He's very new, and I hope that they do let him because it's warranted in this case. He's still learning. But the list that he has submitted is an Ardent Kerouac with Memory of Breath and Focused. Focused on the Ardent Kerouac is just there so that you can get Dismay off. Dismay is a very, very powerful spell, but it is notoriously difficult to cast because it requires a very high number of successes, and Focus just gives you that decent chance of doing so. Memory of Breath gives his unit +1 Aura of Death, so no surprises, he's going to be in a 5-strong unit of Flame Berserkers with Standard Bearer. This unit is a fast, light, dangerous, high aura of death, high attack, high durability unit that the Ardent Kerouac, thanks to being a medium stand, allows to score. We then have 2 units of Wardens, each with a Standard Bearer. Wardens are a unit, I've previously seen Cameron run these as a one-of, kind of like flank punch unit that can move in as a hammer to other units' anvils. They are durable, but they're not hugely durable. They're just Dweghom tough. In this list, Cameron has chosen to go with 2 of those units, indicating that he's looking to get more work out of them, potentially bring them onto the table earlier. Wardens are expensive, and Devout is an Achilles heel some of the time for that regiment, but you can't really argue with 6 attacks, Clash 3, Cleave 1 with the full Ardent Creed powering them up. I'm slightly skeptical on 2 of them because they really want to play with other regiments, but they're movement 6. This is going to enable Cameron to pursue kind of like an aggressive style of play with them, but he is going to need to protect them or let them get the first punch in. Otherwise, he's going to be stuck relying on the Ardent Creed making them good all the way until they're dead to get value out of them. We then have a Hold Reg's Warband. The Hold Reg is juiced up. He has Threadbrood, full combat 3, baptized in combat, and he will be in a unit of 5 Hold Thanes. No Herald, just 5 Hold Thanes, great quality heavy infantry that he will be adding extra juice to. We then have a unit of 4 Initiates. Initiates are a bit of a best kept secret in Dweghom. They were kind of terrible for a long time. But what they do is they hold very, very well. They're one of the more durable units in the game for their points cost. They are effectively like they're tougher than, say, Hoplites, and Hoplites are tough. We have Defense 3, just native Defense 3 with a shield, 5 wounds, and Resolve 3. With a unit of 4, it means they can sustain 4 wounds and still have Resolve 4. The unit is just tough, which means that it holds well. Now, it's not necessarily tough to serve as a full anvil for, say, the Wardens, but it can hold for a bit. And if, say, they're brought onto the table early and then the Wardens follow up, you can get a cheap, like, 400 points, sub 400 points gets you Initiates as an anvil, Wardens as a hammer, self-sufficient, good enough. But they are, if nothing else, very good holding regiments. Finally, and rounding the list's heavy presence out, we have a unit of Dragon Slayers with a Standard Bearer and an Ironclad Drake. Now, props for the synergy here as well. Dragon Slayers are a unit that I think has been broadly rendered not exactly obsolete by the Ironclad Drake, but close to. The Ironclad Drake, for fewer points, just generally outperforms the Dragon Slayers. Terra 2, Cleave 2 is more useful than Cleave 3 most of the time. There are a bunch of reasons. The Drake is not necessarily more durable, but it stays at full effectiveness for 16 wounds, whereas 16 wounds dealt to the Dragon Slayers will drop them down considerably. And the Drake is much, much, much faster with native unstoppable, not having to pay for Standard Bearer, and movement 7. The Drake is just more well-rounded. It's not necessarily over. It's close to overtuned. I think it's as far as you can push a unit's power, particularly given how generalist it is, without it being too much. But the Drake is exceptional. The fact that Cameron's list is playing the Ardent Creed, however, brings Dragon Slayers back a little bit because that command stand of the Dragon Slayers is really, really dangerous. It has the extra 2 attacks, it will auto rally if the unit is broken, etc. And what the list being Ardent Creed means is that like just Agam is eternal. We forget about this rule half the time. It only comes up occasionally. Rule that the Ironclad Drake has, which gives flurry to regiments inside a small bubble around him, actually has the potential to do a ton of damage relative to how it would perform in, say, a tempered list in this list. So overall, what we have is an aggressive, all melee, very heavy and light focused, able to play all parts of the game. This is not a combined arms army like we saw from Tom. This is nothing but melee, and much of it is very dangerous melee. I do think that it's going to be in a position where it will struggle from like turns 3 to 4 as the medium units begin to sustain casualties. They're not, like the Wardens in particular, are not that durable for their points cost. They're just dangerous. And the Flame Berserkers without support, because they are their only light regiment, will eventually begin to struggle. It's going to have that moment of pressure where the Flame Berserkers are beginning to be spent, the Wardens can't necessarily fight everything by themselves, and the heavies haven't yet arrived. If this list rolls well, particularly for its heavy reserves, then it will be very, very scary, because in that situation, the heavies will be able to arrive before the mediums and lights are fully spent, and the overwhelming melee power of this list will come into full effect. For that reason, that slight tactical vulnerability, that vulnerability to poor reserve rolls, I'm going to give this list a 2 out of 5, but I love it. Like, I think it's going to win. Like, there's a good chance that Cameron wins 2 or 3 games with this. We'll call it maybe a 2.5. There's a good chance that Cameron wins 2 or 3 games with this. But there are going to be games where he's at the mercy of reserve rolls, and in a 5-round event, you're going to have those games. There are different ways to play through that. I have run lists that just have so many heavy regiments that I can't possibly fail all of them, and which play to the very, very late game, although it's dangerous in a event that has timed rounds. But in this particular case, all of Cameron's heavy regiments are important and useful enough that it's going to be a pain for him if they turn up too slowly. So yeah, for that reason, I'm going to say this list is a 2.5 out of 5, but I really like it. Props to Cameron for doing something interesting and different. This list is a banger. Now, our third Dweghom list is the only creedless Dweghom list. This list has been submitted by KJ Moss, and it's running a Holdraig Burgont Warlord. What that means is that the Holdraig is riding the Ironclad Drake. Now, whether or not that's a good choice strategically is a bit of an open question, but the model is outstanding. I think there's a non-zero chance that KJ has chosen to run this model as the Warlord because it has to be the Warlord, just because the model itself is so excellent. Will be interesting to find out. So the list is comprised of a Holdraig Warlord riding an Ironclad Drake, a minimum unit of Hold Ballistae, a minimum unit of Hold Warriors. We then have an Ardent Kerouac who has Flaming Oratory, Memory of Breath, and the Crown of Ushkelod, which means whatever regiment he joins will have Burnout, Tenacious, Indomitable, and Aura of Death +1. The only being Priest 5, it's a bit of an open question as to whether or not he'll be able to reliably cast either of his spells, and for that reason I suspect that he's probably going to be in the... he's probably going to be in the Flame Berserkers because that's usually where you see the Ardent, giving that Memory of Breath combining with the existing Aura of Death. Burnout is an interesting choice for this unit. It makes them very, very fast, but with the Ardent Kerouac in that unit, there will be 5 stands, which means you'll be rolling 15 dice worth of Burnout. Usually that means you'll just take 3 wounds, but Burnout is a risky draw event to use on such an expensive unit. I think it's definitely got huge potential as playmaking, but for 30 points, that crown is... It's a choice. I think it's a very interesting one, and I'm fascinated to see how it works for KJ. It might be that you'll never use it, except for 1 or 2 games where it proves decisive. Now, that said, giving Tenacious to Flame Berserkers sounds nightmarish, as Indomitable. That's going to make that unit go the distance more than, say, the unit that we saw Cameron fielding would. Although Cameron compensated for that by just having more Flame Berserkers. He just has 5 more wounds, whereas KJ's regiment has Tenacious and Indomitable. We then have a unit of 4 Wardens with a Standard Bearer and another unit of 4 Wardens with a Standard Bearer. This is a risky choice. This is not an Ardent Creed list. These regiments can be broken relatively easily. It only takes 10 wounds to break this regiment and another 5 to shatter it. But fighting 4 wide will definitely maximize the offensive strength of those Wardens. We then have a Tempered Steel Shaper, who I suspect will be fighting in a unit of Hold Ballistae and a unit of 4 Fireforged. The reason why I think the Steel Shaper will be fighting in the unit of Hold Ballistae is that he's a medium stand, who then makes the Hold Ballistae scoring, which means that this army has 2 medium characters who can fight in light regiments and score early. In some scenarios, you might have that you don't need that, but I don't think the Steel Shaper will necessarily fit well in the Fireforge because they are fighting 4 wide. Going to 5 wide with a ranged unit, it can work, but they're short range, they don't have arcing fire, so my expectation is he'll be in the Hold Ballistae. This is a list that I want to like, but I'm going to give this one a 1.5 out of 5. I think, firstly, just the decision to play the Hold Reg competitively is one of the few kind of objectively wrong decisions, the Holdraig Burgont in particular. I think it's one of the few objectively wrong decisions that you can make in Conquest. That Holdraig could have gone in a unit of anything. It doesn't materially debuff. Like, Burgont Reg is not a particularly good rider as far as riders go, and by choosing to play the Holdraig, you lock yourself firmly out of access to one of the 2 very good creeds. If this Ardent Kerouac, for example, had been the Warlord, then every command stand in the list would have gotten +2 attacks, and every regiment would have auto-rallied itself. And that's much better, basically, than the free Memnance's Apprentice, 25-point free Memnance's Apprentice that the Hold Reg gives you. So I think as much as the model is incredible, it's kind of an objectively wrong choice to play a Burgont Ray as the rules currently work, and I really hope that Parabellum addresses that, because there are not a lot of warlords that just debuff your army by taking them as the warlord. Typically, supremacy abilities are a positive buff. That said, this list absolutely will still kick some ass and take some names. I don't think in fact, there is not a single list submitted to CanCon that does not have the potential to win games. There is not going to be a list that we will see this evening that is ranked A0. There is no list I think won't win at least one game, which mathematically means I'm probably being a little bit optimistic because at least one player is probably going to end up in that situation, but let's not dwell too much on that. Things about this list, if I play against this, I'm super curious to see how they go. I'm very interested to see if KJ can manage the risk associated with the 4-strong Wardens and the use of all of the defensive buffs on the Ardent Kerouag, particularly given that those Berserkers have the Memnancer Apprentice. It's one of the few upsides of the Hold Reg is that Memnancer Apprentice is free, I guess. The ability to actually declare realistic duels, maybe break, the offensive and defensive output balance. I would love that Flame Berserker regiment to be just a little bit bigger, to really, really make use of the combination of tenacious and indomitable. But nevertheless, I think it's got great potential. I also think the Crown of Ushkalod it's not a piece that I would pick, but I want to see how it goes. If I get a chance to drop by and see how games are being played, I don't know KJ, but if I recognize the list, I'm very curious to see what he's able to do with that Burnout Draw event, because the potential, Flame Berserkers are highly dangerous, the potential is definitely there. So, 1.5 out of 5 for this list. Let's move on to the last Dweghom list. So our final Dweghom list is the second Tempered Creed list, and it is a fully all-in on Tempered Creed list submitted by Scott Bartell. It begins with a Tempered Sorcerer Warlord riding a Hellbringer. To note, is a Magma School Warlord, and he's managed to afford the Chthonic Flame upgrade, which means that if he hits you with those Magma spells, you'll be forced to reroll successful resolve checks against him. He has a unit of Fireforge with a Standard Bearer, and then the obligatory Hellbringer Drake that he is riding. We then have a second Tempered Sorcerer. This one's running Earth School, which is a choice. It's a tech choice, but Earth, like Magma, does have the notable advantage that it can begin casting spells from the first turn. This Tempered Sorcerer will be fighting a unit of Fireforge with Standard Bearer, and then he's bringing along a unit of 3 Inferno Automata. We then have a Tempered Steel Shaper, fighting in, again, a unit of Hold Ballistae, and then a unit of 3 Steelforged. Then we have an Ardent Kerouag with Combat 2 Arcane 1. He's presumably, but not certainly, fighting in that unit of Flame Berserkers with Standard Bearer. Then we have a unit of 3 Wardens with Standard Bearer. So the notable thing about this list is that you can't spend tokens through the Ardent Kerouag, but if he casts spells, he will still generate tokens, which means that from very, very early in the game, this list can be generating as many as 5 tokens per turn. And that's the most we've seen of any of these Dweghom lists. There is not going to be any attempt necessarily here. Like, he can absolutely bank tokens, and he will be, but he'll be generating enough tokens every single turn to produce a significant effect from the Tempered Creed. The list is also packing an absolute ton of guns, with 2 units of Fireforged, a Hellbringer Drake, and a unit of Hold Ballistae, meaning that it's got tons and tons of ranged output in addition to the magical output. There are some lists that will run into this, and those guns, if the guns can be pointed in the right directions, will be just absolutely ruinous. This is the strongest we've seen a Dweghom gun line. It's just that the cost of that gun line is that the melee presence in the list is down to just some solid, like good, but not outsized, not reinforced, not ultra durable units. We don't have, for example, the extremely powerful Ironclad Drake. This list is really, in fact, I think this list has no heavies at all, which means it will be on the field very early, but the most powerful combat units that it has are minimum unit of Flame Berserkers, minimum unit of Wardens, minimum unit of Steel Shapers, Steel Forged. So this list has to take powerful advantage of its shooting, it needs to concentrate fire, and it needs to keep those thin melee units alive by just juicing them with the Tempered Creed. This list, I think, rolls in at a clean 3 out of 5. I think it has just a few inefficiencies in its construction that could have been turned into a sort of more honed and optimized list. There are just, for example, there are standards on a lot of the units. Standards on range units are nice to have, but hardly essential. Those standards could be cut. There are bits and pieces. The combat retinue, for example, combat 2 on the Ardent Kerouac, you could cut that. And if you cut a bunch of those pieces, you would end up with, like an extra stand, for example, of steel forged, which could potentially make a really large and meaningful difference given how few melee units this list has. I think the games that this list wins will leave its opponents walking away just being like, how is it fair that Dweghom have all of these guns and magic? But the games that this list loses might be a feels bad for Scott, because if he gets engaged on, if his opponents can punch through his armor, if he gets surrounded and swarmed and he can't bring those guns to bear, it's going to feel like, well, what could I do? What was I supposed to do? And so this list, there's a very good chance of seeing both the strengths and weaknesses of the Dweghom gun line at play. It's going to have to use those offensive spells to unjam its and jam its gun line. It doesn't necessarily have the offensive spells to do that. One of the things that's notable is, although I think that actually Magma Sorcerers probably have very slightly exceeded Fire Sorcerers in terms of general applicability, Magma Sorcerers work well if you have two of them. A second Magma Sorcerer rather than an Earth Sorcerer would let you really maximize the damage that you can do with the offensive nukes that Magma has. Just one of the sorcerers need to establish the terrain that you can then cast spells through, and then both of the wizards can use their offensive spells to get those 5 armor piercing in the flank hits, which doesn't sound like a ton, but it's easy to cast. You just need 2 successes, you get a high relative result. Instead, we have a stone sorcerer. Because there's no fire and just one magma sorcerer, and then the rest of the wizards are all just buffers and debuffers, there isn't really necessarily a way to unjam, say, the Fireforged if they get engaged. You're going to rely on other range units shooting into combat, which is fine, or your few melee units to unjam your ranged units. You don't have access to just like Dweghom offensive spell power to clear off melee units that make it into melee with your Fireforged. So we're going to call this list, yeah, like this is a 2.5 or 3 out of 5. It's absolutely going to win some games, but I think it's trying to. If it the games that it wins will be off the strength of that gun line, and the games that it loses will be off the weaknesses of that gun line. So that's our 4 Dweghom players. Up next is 100 Kingdoms. So we have 100 Kingdoms player. It's the least popular faction at CanCon. 100 Kingdoms player who is Dylan Humphreys. I'm actually surprised that there is only 100 Kingdoms player at CanCon, because 100 Kingdoms is not just a strong faction, but they're a faction right now that have multiple viable competitive builds. There are strong infantry-based builds, like infantry melee builds. There are goblin lists that can run very, very wide. And then, of course, there are the superlative Ashen Dawn, which are competing with things like the Ironclad Drake for most undercosted power heavy in the game at time of recording. Dylan, however, is not really leaning into any of those archetypes, but he's chosen to do something quite interesting with particularly his primary warband. So the first warband, not a commander. We have a primary commander, but not a warlord, Crimson Tower. No upgrades on him. He will most likely be fighting in a unit of 4 Crimson Tower with a standard bearer, and then the second regiment in his warband is a unit of 5 Crimson Tower with a standard bearer. We've then got an Imperial officer who is just absolutely juiced to the gills to both fight in and support a ranged unit, who will probably be fighting in that, wow, 5 strong unit of Hunter Cadre. We then have a 6 strong unit of Gilded Legion, veterans and a standard bearer, so they're all the way up to Clash 3, with a seasoned veteran giving them Bastion 1. The Hunter Cadre are veterans as well, so they are Volley 2, Clash 3, which means that that's a Speed 6, or Speed 5 if the officer is in them, fluid formation unit. It can absolutely fight in both ranged and melee, which is super interesting. We then have 2 units of Mercenary Crossbowmen, just one of the best, probably the best value range unit for cost in the game, and a Chapter Mage Warlord Arcane 1 School of Water in a unit of Men-at-Arms. So, this list is very interesting. I don't know how well it will perform, but I really like the thought process that is happening here. Typically with, especially like what we would call a on-meta Hundred Kingdoms list, what you will usually see is, assuming that the player running them does not yet have access to Sealed Temple, we see a Crimson Tower with Warlord with 2 units of Crimson Tower who are just there to unlock 2 big regiments or big to medium regiments of Order of the Ashen Dawn. That's then typically going to be supported with just half of a Goblin list, Imperial officers, stuff like that, just to get more things on the board, just to fight and hold and score until the Ashen Dawn arrive. Now, this is a very, very powerful list archetype. We've seen, if you want, there's a blog called Brave Humans with Sticks. Hannah from Germany has done just a ton of games in that sort of exploring Hundred Kingdoms generally, but also exploring that style. It's very strong, but the problem with it really is that you're paying for 2 whole units of Crimson Tower, and they're there as an afterthought. And it can often be challenging with that list archetype to maximize the full effectiveness of the Crimson Tower, because what they're going to be doing is they're just not going to be arriving early in the game, because the Ashen Dawn will have priority for your reinforcement rolls. The bulk of the impact that those 2 units of Crimson Tower will often have is to just roll some dice so that the second unit of Ashen Dawn arrives as soon as possible and is fighting as soon as possible. This list forsakes that and basically says, no, we are going to make the Crimson Tower the hero of the show. And Crimson Tower, it must be noted, if they are given attention and you devote your battle plan to them, can absolutely be the stars of the show. This is a Clash 3, high attacks, high defense, wedge, brutal impact, terrifying cavalry unit. A charge from these things annihilates stuff, particularly a 5-strong regiment. It's just that they are really like never given the time to shine because they're playing second fiddle to Ashen Dawn. Now, would Ashen Dawn be more powerful? Probably. Ashen Dawn are really, really powerful, but this has potential. The Imperial Officers Warband is also super hilarious. Like the Gilded Legion block is just that's totally fine. 6 of them is right on the minimum unit size that I would go to for a unit of Gilded Legion like this. Also, personally, I know that Veterans is more popular. I'm an absolute sucker for Relentless Drill. I wouldn't be surprised if you did the math on that Hunter Cadre unit. I wouldn't be surprised if it was surprisingly close. The extra attacks from support versus the extra clash that you have to pay for from veterans. But setting aside my personal love of getting things for free in wargames, which is to say I prefer Relentless Drill, the highly versatile veteran hunter cadre with the Imperial officer who has the deadly shot. It's showing him as Barrage 3, but that's almost certainly incorrect because it's probably just not correctly calculating the combination of Kiss Farewell and Marksmanship. Then he's got all of Aim for the Head, Fire First, Aim Later. So that Hunter Cadre unit will just be zippy as heck. It should be able to aim, shoot, march. It'll be able to fluid reform and charge. If it's caught in combat, it can potentially fight its way out. Now it's expensive as hell. It's almost 500 points when you add in the cost of the Imperial Officer, but it's a Vanguard light scoring unit. So early in the game, it can get onto objectives, stuff like that. It's got the Standard Bearer. So I love almost all of the ideas that are on display here. I do think this list is probably a bit too ambitious. I think the Imperial, like the very uh, expensive unit Imperial Officer Warband, the expensive Crimson Tower Warband, this list does not have many centers of gravity. If those mercenary crossbowmen go down early or someone manages to circumvent them, I feel like there isn't as much chaff as this list would like to really guarantee that those Crimson Tower get the charges. I feel like what you want here is some slightly more dedicated anvil units, things that can just hold in place. The mercenary crossbowmen are wonderfully efficient, but they are not holding regiments. They will survive probably for like maybe one, like they'll probably die in one clash most of the time. So the concepts at play here are awesome. This is another list I would love to play against. I would love to just be a fly on the wall watching it. I think there are some wonderful ideas, but this list's ambition is potentially going to undo it. I'm going to give this list a 2.25 out of 5. I think just those cavalry will carry the day in some games. The Hunter Cadre will just absolutely sucker punch at least one opponent, and it has enough guns to do things like give Old Dominion a hard time. But I think that this list is going to, sooner or later, hubris will catch up with this list, and it will just want for a little bit more of what it's trying to do, with a little bit more of the meat and potatoes that it kind of needs to make the big, flashy, flexible pieces pay off. I love it, but I think it's going to go probably 2. If it's lucky, 3. But if Dylan is a sufficiently good player and he knows something that his opponents don't, they underestimate those Crimson Tower, he could comfortably outperform those expectations. That said, he is a shoo-in for Best in Faction because he is, at time of recording, the only 100 Kingdoms player, so very good luck to Dylan. From 100 Kingdoms, we are moving on to Nords, and our first list is Nathan Gibbs. This list is a rare Jarl Warlord choice, which is super cool. Normally with Nords, you would see the Shaman Warlord. The Shaman Warlord Supremacy ability is, frankly, it's too powerful, it's too easy to use, it's incredibly strong, but it's also faction-definingly strong, so perhaps there's an argument for bringing other warlords up to the strength of the Shaman rather than necessarily just knocking the Shaman back a peg. Nevertheless, the Jarl Supremacy is very cool. It's a kind of doesn't do anything first part of the Supremacy, where it allows light regiments to score if they have characters in them. That will matter in this list, actually. But it gives Opportunist. And Opportunist, among other things, works on ranged attacks, and ranged rerolls are very, very rare in Conquest. So there is some real potential around a Jarl Warlord list that it seems like Nathan is attempting to make use of. So we have a Varga Lord to begin. The Varga Lord is carrying Reangir, the God Spear, who's going to absolutely crank his impacts. We can see 7 impacts with Brutal Impact 2. That's off the back of Reangir, which means that when he charges, just absolute devastation will ensue. He is probably fighting in that unit of 4 werewolves. By going from 4 up to 5, you have sort of quite nice break math. The regiment has to sustain 3 stands worth of casualties before it breaks, which means that Regeneration 3 does not go that far, but if it's likely to let that regiment make use of regeneration. It's not 100% that he will be in the werewolves though, because the other reason why you can choose to run for werewolves, despite the break risk, is just to mitigate bloodlust. It will take their resolve up by giving them the higher unit size, and they could just be running 4 by themselves for that reason. We then have 2 units of Fenrir Beastpack. Fenrir Beastpack are some of the best value units in the entire game, even before you just give them not flank, sorry, give them opportune Flurry, there we go, got there in. Give them Flurry from being in a Varga Lord's Warlord. Their list of rules is high and strong. High number of attacks, Flurry, Fluid Formation, Loose Formation. Oh, they have Opportunists as well, doesn't really matter because they have Flurry, Terrifying, 6 attacks, outstanding units. We then have our Jarl Warlord. The Jarl is Wolf Aspect with Coils of the Serpent and Tactical 1. He's not trying to do that much, but he's dangerous enough. And he's not expensive, only 110 points. Coils of the Serpent, I believe, is the one that gives +1 evasion to the regiment he's in, so he is almost certainly going to be in that big block of 5 raiders. Taking them from evasion 1 to 2 means that they are able to do basically just a great deal of damage. Survive relative to their points cost. Now, a slightly unusual choice Nathan has made here is to put a captain in the raiders. The captain increases the resolve of the raiders by 1, but it does not increase the resolve of attached characters, I believe, which means that if the Jarl joins them, the plus resolve from the captain is wasted. The other thing that the captain does is he lets the unit, you can choose for the unit to be medium at the beginning of the battle, which is primarily useful to allow them to score, but with the Jarl Supremacy ability, as long as the Jarl is attached to them, they can score anyway. Also, he's medium. So the captain there is kind of an odd choice. It's not a cheap attachment. I do wonder if there's something there that I'm missing, but that is like that unit, even with those attachments, 5 strong only costs 205 points, and with the Jarl in it force multiplying, I might critique the choice there in terms of the captain, but that unit is intensely efficient, and with evasion 2, and usually it will be at least resolve 4, it's not going anywhere either. We then have a unit of 3 Berserks, powerful, dangerous, heavy infantry unit. No Gothi on these, so no Blessed, but that's probably the right choice for a smaller regiment. It's just not that useful to pay. Gothi is a very expensive upgrade, so paying for it on a minimum unit probably not the best choice. We then have a Coninger warband. The Coninger is not paying points for retinue, which I think is probably the right choice in this particular case, but he's kitted out for dueling. Heriolf's Folly will give him evasion 3, Massive Frame will let him ignore the first wound that he takes each duel, and then the Broken Blade takes his high attack, high cleave, no cleave, high attack, high clash, but no cleave, up to cleave 1. So he, actually, when I say kitted out for dueling, Hrolf's Folly and the Massive Frame are two skills that let him survive duels, but otherwise, it's well worth noting that the Conungur is just 7 attacks, clash 4, cleave 1. That's super good. You don't necessarily need to pay for those two upgrades, but if you want the Conungur to survive, particularly multiple duels, or go toe-to-toe with some of the more dangerous dueling pieces, you do need those. This Conungur, for example, is within spitting distance of being able to engage, say, a lower tier Fallen Divinity, and actually come out the other side having done some wounds to her. And that is a rare thing. In his warband, we have a unit of 3 Bowchosen, excellent ranged unit, and a unit of 4 Huskarls, which is almost certainly which is where the Conungur will be fighting. They have both a Skald and a Then, so they have Bastion, Fearless. The Skald giving the regiment extra resolve in this case is probably not going to be that relevant because the Conungur will be joining, but the Fearless is Bravery rather is a very relevant ability. Bravery is well more powerful than Fearless. Bravery is actually one of the rarest and most powerful units in the rules in the game. Because it doesn't just allow you to ignore Fearsome and Terror, it just also auto-rallies the regiment every time the regiment activates. The closest, like it's not quite as powerful as Dauntless, I think the rule is, where you just never can break, but it's very, very good. We then have an Ice Jotnar, the strongest of all of the Jotnars, and a very powerful piece, expensive, durable, and in particular, because this list lacks a Shaman, adding some interference. It's on a heavy piece, so it will be turning up a little later in the game, but this list will have, thanks to the Ice Jotnar, some capacity, if it needs to blunt powerful, say, Dweghom enemy offensive spellcasting. This list, I think, overall has a great deal of just strong offensive potential. Every unit in the list is capable of doing great violence, being very dangerous, and this is sort of how Nord lists are. It's because of Raiders being such a self-sufficient unit, and this list actually takes pains to make the Raider unit not just dangerous but fragile, but dangerous, very dangerous, and kind of durable. Everything in this list has legs, has a lot of legs potentially. It's also quite well built in terms of the light, medium, and heavy split. It's got a nice number of lights, a nice number of mediums, and only one heavy, which means that there's a very good chance that this list is entirely on the table as early as turn 3. It's got a lot of scoring, with only the Bowchosen being unable to score in some capacity. That is assuming that the Varga Lord joins the Werewolves in order to make them a scoring regiment, because he's medium, so his stand will score. And we even have some decent quality, admittedly in small amounts, ranged from the Bowchosen. So this is just a good Nord punch list that might be able to pull some fascinating little surprises out of the Jarl Warlord supremacy. Every individual thing in this list I kind of like, and I think actually if other Nord players were to look at this, the thing that I would take away and steal for my own lists, my precious, is that Jarl Raiders unit. One of the things that I love doing in any game like Conquest is taking a chaff regiment, and we'll see this when we get to my lists, taking a chaff regiment and making them dangerous. Force multiplying little shitters up into something that's strong is wonderfully fulfilling, I find. And the fact that that Raider unit has 5 stands, it could cost less than 205 points. If you cut the captain, just ran the shield biter, and then popped that Jarl into it, I am here for that in a big way, and it is not expensive. So big props to that little innovation in particular, I think is super cool. That's a dangerous scoring light regiment. It's just really, really good. Otherwise, the list is going to be reliant on the fact that lots of it is dangerous and that lots of it can kind of fight independently. But I'm not 100% sure it is able to play ruthlessly enough to fight into a disciplined combined arms list. If I look at this list, I think it's going to come down to the wire if it plays against some of, say, for example, the combined arms Dweghom lists that we've seen. Because those loose formation Fenrir are only going to go so far, even with loose formation against the likes of Dweghom shooting and spellcasting. This is the list that I really want to do well, but I think its game plan is probably ultimately just a bit straightforward. It's got a very good chance, I think, of going something like 3 wins, which is absolutely a winning record. It's well built. It's got a nice optimized reinforcement curve. Everything can individually fight. but I'm not sure it can necessarily break through, for example, one of the 4 Dweghom players, and particularly I think if it runs into one of the 2 Dweghom tempered players, it's going to run into some issues. It's also a bit of an open question. There are some very, very dangerous Wardrune lists present that we'll get to in the final segment of this list review, and some of those Wardrune lists are toxic for Nord players. Not in the sense of toxic players, in the sense of they are just poison for your list. So we will see how this goes. I'm going to give this one a solid winning record, 3 out of 5. It's a wonderful list, and I really want to see in particular how those raiders perform. Our second Nord list is the first of 2 Shaman Warlord lists, and this belongs to Ewan Bailey Thiel. I had the very good pleasure of playing against one of the earlier versions of this list against Ewan on TTS. I say TTS because he is 3 hours and 30 years in the past over in Western Australia, and the game was illuminating. Not only is Ewan an absolutely exceptional player and a wonderful, wonderful opponent, but he plays this list with like just perfect and precise maximal aggression. The game experience from my perspective was like being Alice Marchese in the Lauren Phillips lifting Alice Marchese meme, and if you don't get that reference, you're a wonderful and pure soul. I spent most of the game pinned back to within a double march of my own deployment line, and it wasn't until like turn 7 that I made any progress toward the distant objectives. That is to say, this list makes full use of the Shaman Supremacy ability, giving 2 units Vanguard every single turn, and in particular, Ewan was very disciplined with bringing on things like his heavy units, only at a time when they could maximize the use of that Vanguard move. So we have Arcane 1 Retinue Shaman in a unit of 3 raiders with a captain. The shaman will often not be making a particularly active role in the game. He will be getting into that regiment. The captain will be making the regiment medium, and they'll just be walking into a zone and scoring it for the rest of the game. We then have a unit of light raiders with nothing. This is a 110 point unit that can fight very efficiently thanks to a combination of flurry, impacts, and blood of the Einherjar. But mostly what those 2 raider units serve to do is unlock a pair of Sea Jotnar. Now, is 2 Sea Jotnar truly competitively optimal? Actually, it might be, particularly given how Ewan plays them. The ability of the Sea Jotnar to make that free volley means that they can do things like, with Vanguard, from reinforcements, march, march, aim and shoot, or march, march, march and shoot. And if they use that to get inside short range, that's a very dangerous attack. Ewan is very proficient at using those to like finish off wounded regiments, just get like an efficient activation out of them. And the Sea Jotnar are still Jotnar. In terms of the power scale of Jotnar, they are the second most powerful. They are very flexible. They are not spellcasters, but the list still has interference through the shaman. But he's playing them because he owns 2 of them and they look incredible. Wonderfully painted list, including an awesome little conversion with a longboat that a regiment is standing in. But Ewan knows how to use those, and he knows how to use them efficiently and maximize that ability that they have. Warband 2 is a Varga Lord with Ryoda the Red Bringer. Now, this is another little piece of tech. The Varga Lord is almost certainly going to be in this Fenrir Beast pack, with the rest of his warband being a second Fenrir Beast pack, and then some Ugur, and then some more Ugur. But what Ryoda the Redbringer does is it gives the regiment Bloodlust and gives him +2 attack. And Bloodlust is the important thing there. Because we've got that Shaman Supremacy, we can give 2 regiments Vanguard every time that they appear, like at the beginning of every turn. And that Vanguard means that you can have a regiment with Bloodlust that can march off of the table using Vanguard, then charge, then clash. Use the Vanguard to actually march off the table edge, and that leaves you with a charge and a clash. Now, Fenrir and the Varga Lord are dangerous, but not like Death Star destroying. But the fact that they can turn up, this list uses Vanguard to aggressively set reinforcement lines. The flanks are hell playing against this list. That unit will wait, and it will threaten, and then it will turn up, and it will take a charge, and it's very, very difficult to stop. There are some lists that are going to be played at this tournament that can basically put units forward that are comfortable dealing with that. And of course, there's always the chance we run into a scenario that restricts the reinforcement lines, or you have a player that like really plays in tight towards the center of the table. But if the player plays in tight towards the center of the table and they don't also aggressively push the reinforcement line back, you still have that same problem where you're surrounded on all sides by these fast and dangerous units. Rounding the list out, we have our third warband, which is a Blooded. He's kitted out for a great deal of shooting. He's Crow with Horn of Hjoldar and Hunter's Instinct. The Horn is going to give the regiment that he's in this case it's a unit of Bow Chosen, the extra hit if they roll a 1, which means that rolls of 1 on the Bow Chosen will do 1 hit precise shot and then 1 additional hit. Bow Chosen, very good, light infantry regiment with the Blooded in them. And that Blooded, he's only got the 2 impact attacks, but he is dangerous enough in melee that those Bow Chosen can be used as objective hunters quite efficiently. You're hoping for the impact attacks to do exactly 1 wound, which they're not guaranteed to do. But if they do, you have a situation where the Bow Chosen can move up and shoot, and the next turn you can charge and clash and potentially kill an objective in a single, basically in two rounds, which is very, very fast by the standards of killing objectives. There are alternate versions that I've seen Ewan play that lean into this more. This version, we've got the Hunt's Instinct for fire in advance, we've got the Horn, we've got Crow. This version is just being more of a range, just a good ranged regiment that does plenty of damage and has fire in advance. Just a little bit of ranged for early pressure, setting the scene, particularly with Vanguard, right? Setting the scene to have the heavy medium emphasis of the list arrive works quite well. Finally, we have another unit of Ogre, meaning that we have 3 units of 3 Ogre in the list. This list is what I would consider very close to the gold standard, almost on meta for modern Nords. It is absolutely ruthlessly maximizing the potential of the Shaman Warlord, and I've seen Ewan play it, and he plays it very, very well. This list would be a solid candidate for a 4 or even potentially 5 out of 5 rating. I would lean towards 4, but we're going to leave it at only 4 and not increase it any higher because of what Ewan is going to be playing against in the first round. We will get to this when we look at the Wardrune lists, but in an extremely cheeky maneuver, former CanCon champion from previous year, Monty from Queensland, has grudged Ewan in the first round, which is an excellent choice on his behalf because playing against Ewan is incredible, and the match promises to be a finals in round 1 because both of those players are comfortably good enough to get to the finals and play in the finals. But when we get to Monty's list, we will see it is built to just absolutely ruthlessly annihilate this kind of Nord list. It's just generally a very well-rounded Wardrune list, but it includes 4 units of Blooded with aberrations, and if there's one thing that this list doesn't like, it's lethal demise. You look at units like Raiders, you look at units like Ugr, who are only defense 2, you look at units like Fenrir, who are only evasion 2 and have low resolve. This list does not like having to just charge into units with lethal demise, particularly units with 15 wounds and decent resolve. That means for all of the strength of this list to, set an aggressive pace and push up the board and threaten off the flanks, all Monty needs to do is just walk units of Blooded up the flank and say, yeah, you got to charge this unit because you can't move on close to anything else. And that Vargr Lord charging into a unit of Blooded with lethal demise has a non-zero chance of just annihilating his own unit in the carnage. And that's a real bad scene. So I think this list is outstanding. If anyone is just looking for a list to play with or against that exemplifies Nord's strengths in one particular, maximal aggression aspect, this is a fantastic one. But God, Ewan, best of luck in the first round, because that fight is going to be tough. Our final Nord list is one submitted by Gareth Holes, and this is another Shaman Warlord list, but it is leaning towards a more well-rounded, less sheer aggression-focused list with more emphasis on all phases of the game. We begin the list with a Volva Warband, not Warlord, Warband, and she's kitted out with Runes of Fate, Runes of Shielding, and full Arcane 3. She's in a unit of 6 Valkyries, and what we have there is one of the game's premier anvils. Nords are not a faction. The whole rest of the Nords faction, the closest thing you will find to an anvil is maybe a unit of Huskarls, and they are not an anvil. But Valkyries with this Volva are absolutely an anvil. They are tough. They fight well in rank with support. They've got Blessed for that excellent defense, and she will heal the absolute bejesus out of them. Like all regiments that are contingent on healing as part of their durability, you do have that risk of duel, but worst case scenario, you can just have the Valkyries rally themselves because they're there to hold, not to fight, although they can fight just fine. Flash 3 with Blessed if they need to support, etc. They can do plenty of damage, but they're there to hold. You just have them, if you need to, you have them rally themselves, and then the Wulva, I think it's pronounced, just goes and heals the absolute hell out of them. So this is an anvil for Nords. If you're a Nord player and you're interested in how to actually have something that the rest of your army can fight around, this is how. It's not over expensive, they are appropriately costed. You can play the Wulva at any number of points. You can have her less powerful than that or more powerful. That just there is we have a centerpiece that you can anchor your line around. We then have the extremely on meta, not obligatory, but very close to, very powerful Shaman Warlord, Golden Torque, and Arcane 1. And the Golden Torque in particular is an interesting choice there. Normally, I would expect to see a Shaman Warlord being played in the way that Ewan played it, where he's just like, yeah, he's just going to sit in a unit of Raiders and score somewhere. His job is to be the Warlord, his supremacy is so powerful. But Gareth has done something I think that is interesting here, where he's decided that no, since he's paying for this character, he's going to go ahead and pay more, and he's going to make it work for him. And thus we have the Golden Torque, which is a 40-point artifact that gives Dread. Dread is an intensely powerful rule. Now, I actually think it could go either way where that Shaman is going to go. I suspect he will go in the unit of 4 Raiders, because 4, particularly Raiders, they're not that durable. 4 Raiders is an... You know what? No, actually, 4 Raiders is kind of an awkward number. It's a fragile number, but I don't think that regiment is durable enough to justify putting the Shaman in. I think that Shaman is going to go in that unit of Berserks, which will give us a unit of total 7 stands with all of the Berserk rules and Gothy giving Blessed and Dread. So what we have there is a second... It isn't an anvil in the same way that the Valkyries are, it's a Death Star. It does everything, it's going to be very durable, it's going to be very dangerous. Yes, if the Shaman is in the regiment, you will use a little bit of offensive power because he is not a dangerous attacker. But the fact that that regiment is packing good wounds, dread, and blessed, and is a cleave, linebreaker, clash, like blah blah blah, that has the potential to go a very, very long way. Someone is going to bash their face into that regiment and just be utterly surprised that it does nothing and they get annihilated on the backswing. Very, very interesting. We then have our second ranged blooded of the event. We have Crow, Horn of Hjogdar, in this case marksmanship rather than the fire and advance, so the call of the hunt. Marksmanship means that he's all the way up to barrow 7. Volley is not particularly high, it's only volley 2, but because of the horn he will have the rapid shot, and 7 with any number, any volley, 7 dice rapid shot is very serviceable. He will be fighting in a unit of Bow Chosen, so we have again that combination of precise shot, rapid shot. Technically that isn't a synergy, because the 2 rules don't interact, but it is very nice. So we have Blooded in a unit of Bow Chosen, unit of Ogre, unit of Ogre, unit of Fenrir Beast Pack. This, I think, is the only Fenrir Beast Pack unit we have seen in the entire event that does not just have Flurry from being in a Vargo Lords unit, but this is just a good solid warband. I think the Ogre are going to perform probably of all of the lists that we have seen. This is a list that will let the Ogre shine the most because it has 2 anvil units, in particular the Valkyries. Those Ogre can move up protected by the anvil of the Valkyries until it's time to move in and counterattack, and that's something, for example, that Ewan's list doesn't have. Ewan relies on just sheer bloody mindedness and like playing to the wall with his list. This list has the option of playing more like a rank and flank, and the Ogre are there as your, you have your hammer and anvil, the Ogre are there as your hammer. Overall, I like this list a lot. This is a clean 3 out of 5. Remember, 3 out of 5 is a winning record. That is a good result for a list. I expect this list to win more games than it loses. It's got just a good, solid core of pieces. Nothing in this list stands out as having the potential to let the list down. The closest thing this list has to a clear vulnerability, apart from a relatively low activation count, which in some cases, Conquest is not like, say, Song of Ice and Fire, where activation count is just the most important thing in a list in some cases. But this list, it has 10 activations out the gate, but it's going to lose some of them relatively quickly. That said, that's not necessarily the end of the world, provided it can maintain 10 activations until the lines are joined, at which point having fewer activations becomes an advantage rather than a disadvantage. That's probably fine. So the other thing that this list has in terms of vulnerability is if it runs into genuine duelists. You have to be very careful. Like a shaman is probably going to be comfortable rallying his regiment uh, rather than casting a spell, but the Wolver and the Valkyries, you have to balance their activations carefully to make sure that you can be unbroken in order to get the heal. The Wolver and the Shaman are dual vulnerable, but it's not really right now. There's not a strong meta of duelists. If these guys run into duelists, they're probably just melee characters, like just some random ass hold reg who is good enough to risk the challenge. And in particular, the Wolver has a reasonable chance of surviving that. She's not terribly no, I'm telling a lie here. I thought she had a shield. She doesn't. Okay, she'll go down like a sack of bricks if she gets hit. So this list has to be careful about duels, but duels I would not say are a major strategic concern in the broad theme of how Conquest is currently played. So yeah, this list is a wonderful, clean, perfect example of a 3 out of 5 winning record, and if the player is lucky or plays well, will exceed that comfortably. Up next, we have Old Dominion. There's a good bit of variety in the Old Dominion lists. We have a mix of Fallen Divinity, Strategos, and Archimandrite Warlords, which is kind of nice. The only thing that is notably missing there is the Heliarch Warlord is very, very strong, and the absence of a Heliarch Warlord at CanCon, I think, is an interesting um, statistical blip. I don't think it's indicative of any kind of like Australian conception of the lack of the Heliarch's power. I think just by coincidence, a number of people have chosen not to take one. So, starting with Scott's list, we have a mounted Strategos Warlord. He's packing Aventine armor and Skofnung, and he'll be fighting in a unit of 4 Cataphractoi with a Hetarios and Standard Bearer. As mainstays, just a generic unit of Legionnaires with Standard Bearer. We then have a naked Archimandrite, totally serviceable. You can easily play Archimandrites as a naked unit. A lot of their stuff just scales with Dark Power. They're doing things like casting Hazlia's Touch on Devout units. They just need 2 successes, which with Priest 6 they will easily do. So you can play them as a 100-point character easily. We then have a unit of 3 Legionnaires, unit of 3 Carez, unit of 3 Legionaries, and a unit of 3 Moroi. Moroi are kind of a rare pick. I do know why they're in this list. I'll talk about that at the end. We then have a Hero Deacon. Hasn't been able to afford Arcane 1 on the Hero Deacon. It is often worth getting that if you can. In this case, hasn't been able to afford it because there's a lot else that's going on in this list. Hero Deacons in Legionnaires and taking a unit of 3 Canaphores. We then have a Heliarch. The Heliarch is built as a mix of Fight and Aura of Death. Typically, you will see Heliarchs do one or both of Fight well, give the regiment tons of Aura of Death. This is splitting the difference and doing both, so we have Regalia 1 to take Legio 1 Primogenia, Calamitas Blade of the Sailsaw, and the Gladiator. So 6 attacks, Deadly Blade, Cleave 2, Flurry, Terrifying, just fantastic fighter, not full combat retinue 3, but he barely needs it, and he's going to be in a unit of 5 Praetorian Guard with their own Profane Reliquary and Standard Bearer for Aura of Death 4. Now, there are a few odd choices in this list. In particular, I would say the Moroi are a choice that, given any alternative, you would usually see those be replaced by Bone Golems. But I happen to know why Scott has taken those, and that's because I wrote this list for him. He's borrowing my army, and he's using models that I have painted. I do own models that I use as Bone Golems, but they're proxies because I didn't like the actual Bone Golem models in the context of my army, so I can't lend them to him for the event because they're not tournament legal. And there are a number of those concessions that have been made in this list. Should this list have Varangian Guard? Yes, Varangian Guard are excellent, but mine are based 3 stand because I wanted them in loose order because they wield in great axes, so they're not tournament legal. Those compromises are evident here, and Scott, I'm sorry, I'm not doing any more painting before CanCon. That's just something that he is choosing to deal with, and he's borrowing my army, which is otherwise fully painted. Now, with those limitations in mind, this is still a good Old Dominion list. It's running very medium forward, which means that provided the reinforcement rolls aren't terrible, it's going to be on the table and fighting, and that Heliarch and Praetorian unit in particular can be a real anchor if it just doesn't get tontored. I think this list has probably a good chance of going 2 wins, 3 losses. I would rate it more highly, but there are 4 Tontors that are going to be present at this event. I think at least 4 Tontors, and this list just does not have anything that plays into Tontor's, unfortunately. It's relying on a combination of the Cataphractoi and the Praetorians as like its like best units, as those units just get annihilated by Linebreaker Cleave pieces. So Scott, seriously, best of luck, mate. I think if you go 2 for 5, if you go 2 wins, you can be proud of your result with this list. And I think there are lists that you will run into. Like if you play this into city states, for example, and likely also say that 100 Kingdoms list, I think you've got the tools to get the jump on them because the Strategos allows you to do that. But otherwise, this is potentially going to be a tough event for Tom, and I wish him all of the best. In stark contrast, and probably needing no wishes of luck, we have Ben Swallow's Fallen Divinity list. Ben is running Fallen Divinity kitted out full 370 points, giving her both Dread in an Aura and Untouchable, and then the rest of her warband is a unit of 5 Canaphores and a unit of 3 Canaphores. I like that split a lot, and I've spoken to Ben about it. What that means is that you can afford to, basically, with your reinforcement rolls, you just get 1 success if you need to, and you bring those Canaphores on, which means that you can front load that power and start recovering a situation that maybe has fallen behind because you're playing an extremely extra version of Older Dominion where you are not just a little weak early game and strong late game, you're a little weak early game and you're very strong late game. So you have to survive to get to that point. And when the Fallen Divinity begins to eat all of your units, that 5 unit of Canaphores will last longer. We then have a 95 point Arcane 1 Hero Deacon in a unit of 4 Legionnaires. No extra abilities here, but 4 means that unit will just go a little bit further. It'll generate more dark power before it dies, and it has a greater potential to kind of go the distance if it needs to, and have the Hero Deacon. In a Fallen Divinity list, the Hero Deacon's late game offensive power doesn't materialize like it does in a regular Dark Power list, but still, I'm assuming that he had the extra 40 points, and that's a fine place to spend it. We then have a 170-point Heliarch with Aventine Armor for Tenacious, Vexilla of the Lost for Flank, and Regalia 2. Regalia 2 is something that you will only ever see in a Fallen Divinity list because it gives your characters Regeneration 1, which is borderline completely useless right up until one of your characters is a 370-point god, at which point even Regeneration 1 can go a very long way. The Heliarch will absolutely be fielded in that unit of 5 Varangian Guard, who he's giving flank, which means that on turn 3 you can have both the Praetorians and the Varangian Guard just arrive, leaving the second unit of Canaphores to arrive later in the game without any problems. We have 2 Optio Icon Bearer Legionnaires, so that's combining Vanguard with extra dark power when they die, and these are there to push the army toward the higher dark power tiers so that the Fallen Divinity gets to strut her stuff. I'm not sure how Ben plays this list, but I think I particularly like doing is I'm actually relatively willing to bring the Divinity on earlier. I'm quite sure that he will be more conservative because you have to, but I'm happy to bring her on earlier, play her back conservatively, and then just run the Legionnaires over the top of her to fight anything that is attempting to make a run on her. Because if they die, they'll juice her up and let her start contributing to the fight. That's just a personal note. Ben is absolutely a more experienced Fallen Divinity player than I am, and I think there's actually a very good chance, like I would give it at least a coin flip of saying that he is the most experienced Fallen Divinity player probably in the world, just because she has been his absolute baby for a very long time. In general terms, the Fallen Divinity is a piece that the community is widely divided on its power level. There are some people who think that it's just very, very strong, and there are other communities comprised of very good, experienced players who think that she's really just not that powerful and difficult to play for not necessarily high enough payoff. And my personal observation is that that is almost certainly down to the experience of the players in question, both with and against the Fallen Divinity. She is one of the game's higher skill test pieces, where the experience, because she changes the game so significantly, there is no experience like playing with or against a Fallen Divinity. She's different to so much else in Conquest in terms of how she changes the flow of the game and how she is herself a center of gravity for both players. And what that means is that whoever is more experienced playing with or against the Fallen Divinity has an even larger advantage than an experience advantage would usually give in the game of Conquest. She's kind of a dark horse all by herself, and so it's really the player that we are evaluating here, not so much the list. There are things that I would run differently, but I am an absolute Scrooge for cutting points to get more things, whereas this list is running tighter and more elite. It's making use of, for example, flank, expensive to get onto, and there's a high opportunity cost getting flank onto those Varangian Guard, but it allows you to get onto the field more quickly. Because any evaluation of a Fallen Divinity list really is more of an evaluation of the Fallen Divinity player, I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5 because Ben is probably the best Fallen Divinity player, certainly in Australia, and very possibly just period, purely off the grounds of that extreme amount of experience using her. I've not heard anyone talk about the Fallen Divinity more than Ben has. The evidence is there, and anecdotally, Melbourne is one of those communities that thinks the Fallen Divinity is just busted AF, which suggests that Ben is really, really good with her. So I think this list has a very strong chance of going 4 out of 5, and any list that can go 4 out of 5 can get to the finals. From there, it's Life of the Gods. Our third Old Dominion list is a second Mounted Strategos list. This time we have Aventine Armor and Eleuthera, Giver of Mercy. Eleuthera I quite like on the Mounted Strategos. It is a very cheap, just like, you do a bit of dueling, etc. But in his case, it also increases his clash, and on a brutal impact 2 character, who's getting extra impact from being in Cataphractoi, that clash can go a surprisingly long way. So obviously he will be in the Standard Bearer Hatarios Cataphractoi, unlocked by a minimum unit of Legionnaires. We then have a pure Aura of Death Heliarch, so Legio Primigenia and then Aura of Discipline for Untouchable, in a unit of 5 Praetorian Guard with Profane Reliquary, and a unit of 4 Varangian Guard with Standard Bearer. Varangian Guard are one of the few units that I will comfortably run as a 4 of. In fact, Old Dominion generally, I'm comfortable running stands of 4, and that's because they just don't take spike damage thanks to not being able to just whiff a whole bunch of resolve. Even like the same defensive stats as Varangian Guard, but resolve 5, I would be scared to run them as a regiment of 4. But Varangian Guard, there's an upper limit to how many wounds they can take in an attack. It's very unlikely that they get shattered in a round as a result of that unit size, so you just maximize how much can fight. Very good unit, 265 points. We've then got an 80-point Hero Deacon in a unit of Legionnaires with Standard Bearer, unit of Legionnaires, a unit of Canophores, and a unit of Canophores. So just solid, effective. Canophores are wonderfully reliable pieces, slightly less so than they used to be because Blessed no longer allows them to defend against range attacks and spells, but you can use them as a reliable emergency response squad. There are very few like Death Star style units that they can't at least hold in place and hold their own against for a little while. Even things like, say, those Berserks, worst case scenario, they're rolling Evasion 2 with Blessed, which will hold for a very long time, even against things like High Cleave. I've had Canophores go toe-to-toe with units of Dragon Slayers and come out not winning, but like not losing either, and given the points difference, that's significant. So this is a really clean Old Dominion list. It's a heavy focused list. It's not attempting to use flank. It is going to have to develop its board, not just in the early game, but over multiple turns, and win in the late game. I think comfortably, so there are 2 weaknesses of this list. The first is just that it has no light regiments, and that's a thing that sometimes, particularly older Old Dominion lists, will just suffer with sometimes. It's not going to start arriving until the mediums turn up, and that's just the price of doing business with these pieces. I expect that the Mounted Strategos and Heliarch will be prioritized getting onto the board. The Strategos because you need the dark power from being the Warlord, and the Heliarch because that Praetorian unit is one of the things that will keep you in the game fighting over points. The major Achilles heel of this list, though, is the fact that we're playing 2-hour and 15-minute turns. Chris, I believe, is a Sydney-based player that is learning the game, and he's an experienced wargamer. He is cluey. He's played a lot of Song of Ice and Fire, if this is the Chris that I'm thinking of. He will need to play promptly, but so will his opponents. I think the biggest challenge this list is going to run into is that there is a non-zero chance that in 1 or 2 of the rounds Chris plays, his opponent just not intentionally slow plays, but just kind of like doesn't play super quickly, and it's 2 hours and 50 minutes into the event and it's turn 7. And Chris has borderline tabled his opponent, but Dice Down gets called and Chris is denied 3 turns of scoring that he needs to win the game. That's often going to be the story of these lists, unless there is some kind of mechanic in play, or you just have a willingness to engage with your opponent about like, hey, the rounds of like the tournament round is about to end. We're going to wrap things up here. Do you mind if we just kind of like figure out what the score would be? You have to be able to have those kind of conversations, because if you just get called Dice Down, there is a serious chance that this list gets denied critical turns of scoring if both players aren't playing quickly. So for that reason, I'm going to give this list a 2 out of 5. This list would be a comfortable 3 out of 5 in a casual play game. And it's good against some things. I think this list, if this list plays into some of those city states lists and they are not on point with like getting their defenses matched up into certain things, it will just roll over city states. But in a tournament, without early scoring, without light units, which you don't need, but you need to be able to play very quickly. So Chris, my advice to you is to play fast and confidently with this list because you're going to need all 10 rounds. Our final Old Dominion list is an Archimandrite Warlord list, rounding out the trifecta. We're missing only a Heliarch Warlord, and this is a juiced up Archimandrite with devoted to Haslia, Arcane 1, Arcane 2, Arcane 3. This means that he's going to be a very, very good spellcaster, but not going for the full extra 40-point upgrade for the third spell around, which I actually think is sensible. There are ways to make that build work, but in this case it's just, I'm going to cast 2 spells a turn, and one of them's probably going to be a nuke, and it will be a very dangerous nuke. He's fighting in a unit of 5 Praetorian Guard with Icon and Saturn Bearer. Icon Bearer is kind of a I had 10 points spare choice because you do not plan on that regiment dying. But otherwise we have 2 units of Karez. Karez are outstanding, one of the best light units in the game. They need to be escorted into the late game. Early on they are not strong, but late game they're terrifying, exemplifying Old Dominion, but they give you some pressure, and of course those Praetorians will arrive. We then have a unit of 3 Bone Golems to round out the warband. From there we have a Hero Deacon. Now, this is a choice. This is an Unholy Mastery Arcane 3 Hero Deacon for 200 points. Unholy Mastery is the mastery I mentioned with regards to the Archimandrite, where you would usually see it, where if you successfully cast a spell, you can cast with 4 successes, you can cast a second spell for free. It has to be a different spell, but you do get to cast it. Now, the Hero Deacon only has 2 spells, so I assume what it's going to be trying to do, it'll be in that unit of 5 Legionaries with Icon, Standard Bearer, and Optio. Again, Icon Bearer on that I'm not sure about. You are not planning on that unit dying. But he's going to, on himself, cast the Dark Supplication. He's Devout and has Arcane 3, so there's 2 order successes. So with 6 dice, you just need to roll 2 successes to get your second, to then qualify for your second spell, which you have, I think, like an 80% chance of doing, maybe even 90. And from there, you get a full Arcane 3, blast with the Black Flame Coruscation, which is a very serviceable nuke, particularly in the late game. This is a flex. Like, this is someone who has a plan and is like, it's really cool. By God, it's not worth 200 points. Like, I do kind of wonder, I'm going to give James the benefit of the doubt. If I saw this outside of CanCon, my assumption would be that he didn't understand that Unholy Mastery required you to cast a different spell on the second spell casting activation. I assume James is fully aware of how Unholy Mastery works, and he is entirely here to just flex the Dark Supplication to Black Flame Coruscation, like value nuke. That's really cool. But it's a little bit of a flex that I'm not sure Old Dominion can afford in a tournament situation. We then have a 150-point Heliarch, and the formatting of the list has cut off his equipment, but I believe he just has Sailsaw Blade of the Calamitous Blade of the Celsior, and full Combat 3. If we scroll up a little bit, that gives him a kind of like, no, actually it's just Combat 3, disregard, yep, so he's got Cleave 2, that's from Combat 3, 6 attacks, Clash 4. This is probably not the most efficient way to build a fighting Heliarch. Rather than the full combat regalia, you would be better off with Calamitas and Gladiator. That is a more efficient, that's better. It's better for duels, it's better for fighting. This is actually kind of objectively the wrong setup for what a Heliarch wants to do, but it is nevertheless very dangerous, and maybe if you have retinue units that you want to flex, you're doing that for hobby points. He's in a unit of 5 Legionaries with Icon Bearer, Standard Bearer, and Optio. Once again, there's that Icon Bearer, but I suppose if we're going to commit to the bit, we have 3 Icon Bearers. If any of those regiments dies, we're at least getting some consolation prize. The Optio here is definitely... Legionnaires are very much behind the 8-ball, basically since 2.0 edition dropped. I actually have to wonder, I have not met James, but there was a beautiful Old Dominion list that had heavily converted use of like trees and not quite base fillers, but like the Legionnaires were up in trees. It had almost like a Nordic, Slavic kind of vibe. It was an absolute show stealer in terms of conversions. I wonder if James is that player, because if I owned those Legionnaire regiments, I would damn well be playing them too, and to hell with the fact that they're kind of crap at the moment. But he is doing some interesting things here. So the Optios in particular, we'll notice that both of those, we have that Hero Deacon, big regiment. Hero Deacon gives some offensive power, even if you otherwise would be using it normally to do dark supplications. With the Optio for Vanguard, we have the Heliarch kitted out with combat. Again, should probably be Calamitas and Gladiator, but still very dangerous. Big unit of Legionnaires, Optio for Vanguard. We've then got the 2 units of Caress. Yeah, okay, so what's kind of coming together here is that there's only a single heavy regiment in the entire list. There are tons of Legionnaire stands. Legionnaires are not great, but in sufficient numbers and with characters force multiplying them, and with Optio, this list exerts probably as much, like until we see new regiments drop, I think this list exerts probably the maximum possible early pressure that an Old Dominion list can do, because those Legionnaire units with the Optios actually genuinely have the potential to push forward early and fight things outside of their nominal weight class. What the list is not trying to do is fight in the late game. It is just going to be relying on Old Dominion stuff, like being an Old Dominion list, to get it through. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way to play, but this is very different to basically every Old Dominion list that I have seen. I think the spend on characters, particularly that Hero Deacon, I have to give this list a 2 out of 5, because I think the list has tons of Legionnaire stands, and Legionnaires are not good. It is spending incredibly heavily on characters and not necessarily getting a full return on investment. Some of the character spend is inefficient. And I think with Old Dominion, you can't necessarily afford to do that. But I do still think that this list is going to win at least a couple of games, because when those pieces line up together and you present those like rows of Legionnaires with the characters, and your opponent either is expecting Old Dominion to play differently or just isn't familiar with how Old Dominion rubber bands itself back into the game, this list will be able to carry the day. I think the theory here can be made to work, and we've heard about, for example, buffs coming to Legionnaires that may be able to make this list work more, although I'm not sure if the Optio with this change to the Standard Bearer, I don't know what the rules are changing other than what's been spoken about. You can see that in some podcasts. There's a bit of public record there. But the ideas are fascinating. Ultimately, this list feels like a version 1.5 Old Dominion list that is playing in 2.0, which is why I wonder if James is that player with the incredible army from last year. And for that, look, I have to give him props, but I think he's going to have a challenging event. We'll give him an optimistic 2 out of 5 on the grounds that Old Dominion can almost always claw their way back into at least some games. Up next, we have Spires. Spires are the second most popular faction at the event, and we have 5 Spires players. Particular to note is that the Spires players are almost perfectly evenly split between Directorate, Sovereign Lineage, and Underspire, which is interesting. I would have expected Underspire to be probably the most common and Sovereign Lineage to be the second most common, but as it happens, I am the only Underspire player. This is my list here. I'm actually not going to do a great deep dive on this because I have spoken about this list in previous videos. Go to any of the Conquest videos on the channel to have a look at how this list plays. I've played this exact list in, I think, at least one of my most recent videos. I love this list. It is incredibly satisfying to play, but I'm also really looking forward to not playing it anymore once we're past CanCon, because the locals are sick of it and I've played it a ton. Just to go through it very, very briefly, it is a full early game scenario pressure list. It's a Ferromancer Warlord, it has to be for Underspire. We have tons of Strix, tons of Brute drones, tons of Force Grown drones, some Onslaught drones, and then 2 High Clone Executor warbands. The High Clone Executors are there because they are medium characters in light regiments. The first High Clone Executor is in a big unit of Force-Grown, or the second High Clone Executor is in a big unit of Force-Grown drones, giving them Aura of Death 4 and Disperse, and the first unit of first High Clone Executor is a unit of Vanguard Clone Infiltrators, making them scoring and adding a ton of shooting. This list has worked very, very well for me. It is all light and medium, it's very early game focused, and I am worried about dying to Tauntaurs, but with the exception of dying to Tauntaurs, I think this list has game into basically all of the lists at CanCon. Dweghom would be the next toughest matchup, probably tied with Nords, but I feel like I have a fair fight into just about everything, and for that reason I'm going to give myself a 3 out of 5. That is what I'm aiming for at the event. I think I can accomplish it. We will have to see how I do in practice, and you can watch out for battle reports that I'll do hopefully after the event. Our next Spires list is our first Directorate one, and we have some spice in here. This is a heavy shooting list. Now, this is submitted by Andreas Cooper, and Andreas is someone that I'm sure I've either spoken to or played against, but don't know particularly well. I think I've run into him through Song of Ice and Fire, and he's making the jump over to Conquest. There is some cool tech at play here that the only reason I have any idea what's happening is because one of my locals has had a similar idea and played a similar concept. We've got a High Clone Executor kitted out for shooting. We have a Biotic Hive Marksman variant, Tactical 1, 2, 3, he's almost certainly going to be fielded with Marksman variant in a unit of Marksman clones. It is possible that he'll be put in the Vanguard clone infiltrators, but I think he's not going to, and we'll talk about why in a moment. So my assumption is that he'll be coming onto the board in the Marksman clones. He is the Warlord, and this list will be able to do that coordinated assault, which can be very, very solid. He's extremely expensive with all of the things that he's paying for, but basically all of those things that he's taken are well worthwhile. We then have a unit of 4 Vanguard clone infiltrators, 4 Marksman clones, and 2 Force-Grown drones, which are just mainstays to unlock those ranged units. Up next, and here is the spice, we have a Biomancer, 190-point Biomancer, ostensibly just in a unit of Force-Grown drones, but he has Infiltrator variant, Mastery of Flesh 3. That's a little weird, you'd say. What's going on there? I will tell you. That Biomancer is going to arrive alongside the Vanguard Clone Infiltrators, and he's going to join them via Seek New Escort almost immediately. That will mean the unit goes up to 5 strong, and because he has Infiltrator variant, he has the exact same firepower, he has the same firepower as the command stand of the VCI, with 6 shots, rapid volley, etc. And what he is going to do is he's going to juice them all the way up using 2 Biomancies every turn. He will give them Deadly Shot and +1 volley. The damage that he deals to them by giving them +1 volley and an immediate activation, he will then heal with Biotic Renewal later in the game or Mend Flesh immediately. So this is hella tech. It is entirely contingent on successfully seeking New Escort, which means that it can be disrupted terribly if you're just able to jump those VCI before the Biomancer makes the leap, but the odds of doing that with almost any list are extremely low. This is super cool tech, and what you get out of that unit of VCI is just hellish amounts of firepower. I think that unit is going to be the single most dangerous ranged unit, literally, that we will see at this event. There is nothing that comes close to doing as much damage as that unit can do with the Biomancer juicing it. We then have an Avatar Projection Ferromancer with Attracting Pheromones. His warband includes a unit of Strix, and a unit of 4 brute drones who will have flank, which means that, for example, we'll be able to bring, I'm going to assume that the default reinforcements on turn 2 will be the marksman and the brute drones. You can just take those on automatically between flank and your free choice, and then roll for whatever else. We've then got a Lineage Highborn. I think Ablative Flesh is just there because you have 5 spare points. Yep, totally fine. The Lineage Highborn will be fighting in the unit of Incarnate Sentinels, giving them +1 resolve. Then we have a unit of 3 Avatara. So a light, as it were, heavy presence, but there is enough fighting here. We look at these brute regiments. We have Avatara, brute drones, and Incarnate Sentinels. That is just enough. Like, we compare this, for example, to the ranged and spell-heavy Dweghom list that we saw. This list has got an absolute ton of chaff. Frankly, it's got a little more chaff than I would like to see in a list like this. The 3 Force-Grown drone units you're really going to be expending, and I kind of hate expending that many, but it absolutely works with these ranged units. They just need to hold the enemy in place long enough for the VCI and the Marksman clones to shoot, and we have enough heavy stuff, enough melee stuff between the Brutes, Avatara, and Incarnate Sentinels to kind of carry the day. Now, any list with a game plan that relies on Seek New Escort is inherently a slightly fragile game plan, but I'm going to give Andreas the benefit of the doubt and assume that he can pull it off. This list we're going to say is a 4 out of 5. I would, under normal circumstances, like in just a regular pickup game, I would say it's a 3 or a 3 out of 5 list. 3 or 3.5 out of 5 list. It's very good, but it is very concentrated around sort of some specific things. But what this list does, between the combination of the Ferromancer with the -1 defense ability, and the Biomancer, and the Infiltrators, and the Marksman clones, is that this list kills Tauntaurs. You will hit them with the Ferromancer for -1 defense, and then you will light them up with those guns. And this list, I don't know if it can one-round a Tauntaur reliably. In fact, it probably can't one-round a Tauntaur ridden by a Chief, which has pseudo-untouchable. But it comes very, very close, and it has enough drones to throw into the path to buy at that time. And because this list kills Tauntaurs, this list can fight a lot of the Wood-Rune lists that we're going to see, which means we're going to bump it up from, say, like a 3 to a 4 out of 5, because the meta read here is really good. By the by, I noted this is a directorate list. It actually doesn't show, but because there are 0 superior creations being taken, I'm assuming that it's taking directorate just because you may as well have a free ability. Up next, we have our second directorate list from Rupert Crossley, and it's a spicy boy. We have a Biomancer, 165 points, with Generative Aura, Fleshcarver, and Mastery 1, who will probably be appearing in a unit of 9 Force-Grown drones. So, healing and lethal demise and Force-Grown drones, excellent. Unit of Bound Clones, Unit of Bound Clones. Then we have a Lineage Highborn, 2 units of Avatara, and 6 Centaur Avatara, 6 Incarnate Sentinels. Worth noting that the Lineage Highborn has Disorienting Strikes, okay, and Ferromantic Override. So what we're going to see here, there are a couple of things to note. As a criticism of the list immediately, the Biomancer in Force-Grown Drones is pretty cool. It's a cool concept, but it's all light stands, which means it can't score. I dislike that, but I would really dislike it if it weren't for those bound clone units that can follow up and score some zones, which mitigates that somewhat. What we mostly have here, though, is we have a wombo combo list. So Provoke Instability, the Biomancer's Supremacy ability, is an incredible two-edged sword. In fact, I can guarantee you that on the turn that the Biomancer pops a Supremacy, those Force-Grown drones are not going to attack, because they will shred themselves for nothing if they do that. What this list is looking to do is it's looking to combo the successive buffs that you get from Provoke Instability, Burnout, and Ferromantic Override. And you can stack those in an exponentially effective way. So this list is looking to deliver, I mean, it's got 6 Centaur Avatara and 6 Incarnate Sentinels. It's just going to punch you to death. But at some point during the game, it will try and pull the trigger on that combination and get truly, truly potent offensive output, as every time you have those extra out-of-sequence attacks from Ferromantic Override that will not cause decay because they're out of sequence, but will benefit from all of the decay-centric stuff that you've done to the regiment to juice them up. So the high watermark, for example, of those Incarnate Sentinels is massive, and I am very interested to see how much damage they're actually able to do in one turn, and whether or not Rupert can kind of like make the gimmick work. This list, I think, is probably a total middle of the road 2.5 out of 5. It is ultimately a relatively low activation count, low unit count list, and a serious vulnerability that the list has is that if the bound clones and Avatara get taken down, it's down to very few scoring regiments. Some scenarios that doesn't matter, and of course, Avatara are not easy to perish, but there is just a little bit of a risk that the list can be pushed out of zones or run out of scoring. That is the closest thing this list has to a weakness, apart from the fact that it can be manipulated in terms of if your opponent activates you heavily, you may just have to blow that whole load killing chaff. But the concept is very, very cool, and this, incidentally, is a list that has kind of an alternate way to do the thing we discussed. It has a way to kill a Tauntaur, and you're going to have to kill Tauntaurs this event. I don't think this list is as good at killing Tauntaurs as the range-centric Directorate list that we just saw was, but it is certainly very, very cool. I think total middle of the road here, this is a 2.5 out of 5. I expect it to get maybe 2, maybe 3 wins, which is a good result in an event that will be as competitive as CanCon is. From here, we have our first of 2 Sovereign Lineage lists, and this list, The Gripping Hand from Jeff Nicholson, is a reference to, I think now an old, I won't say niche, but an old but classic science fiction universe that is done over multiple novels. I haven't read them, but I looked them up as a result of doing this video. So, Jeff, thank you for introducing me to a really cool universe. The warbands are all also references to that universe. So first we have the Crazy Eddies. This is a relatively cheap Eagle Eye Marksman variant High Clone Executor, presumably who will be playing in that unit of 3 Marksman clones. I will note that those Marksman clones are superior creations. Now, Jeff, I think, is a Sydney player who I've had the pleasure of meeting in the past. His army is wonderful, and he's an absolutely incredible bloke. I do not remember. I know he has justified superior creations Marksman clones to me in the past. I cannot remember what the reason why is. He is confident in it, and fair enough. I would usually not spend those points. However, the 2 superior creation Vanguard clones units, expensive and glass cannon, but very, very capable of being dangerous. 19 attacks at Clash 3 for a mere 180 points. They're not durable, but they are dangerous. Anything is at least somewhat threatened by that. And those units, often what they will do is they will just move up 2 zones and stare at the unit holding them and say, do you want to leave the zone? Because I'm not that expensive. You just stay there, please, and let me concentrate force elsewhere. And if they do have to take a charge, they're very capable of being dangerous. We then have the Lineage Highborn Regiment, Lineage Highborn Warband, and this is our Warlord Lineage Highborn. So the first of these what we've seen, and yep, she's fully kitted out. In fact, she is overspent what you would normally see on a Lineage Highborn. Cascading Degeneration, Ferromantic Override, Sensory Augmentation. That third mutation from Legacies of the Ark can be any number of things. I think that's a cool pick. I think Sensory Augmentation can play very well into deciding whether to use your Ferromantic Override, and then attracting Pheromones for flank. She is certainly going to be in a unit of 6 Incarnate Sentinels, and by giving them flank, well, look, it's a unit of 6 Centaur Avatara. They'll be able to come on at the same time, not at the vagaries of your reserve rolls. To afford those 2 units, we have two Avatara regiments. One of them is 3 strong with Superior Creation Standard Bearer, and so is the other. So these are expensive because we're paying for standards and Superior Creations, but Superior Creations does go a fairly long way on Avatara. The jump from Clash 2 to 3 is significant. Jeff has played this list actually in a small Canberra event locally. It was great to see him. Tried to return the favour, but fate intervened in our attempts to go back up to Sydney. I hope that they are still running events in Sydney, because I would love to play a game against Jeff. This list runs very similarly to the Directorate list that we just saw, but it is not trying to be too clever. It's just big, powerful pieces with good shooting and good scenario pressure. The Vanguard clones exert sort of a pressure of their own. The Marksman clone unit is very solid, etc. And then you have the Wombo in this case is just self-contained within the Lineage Highborn, who's able to use sensory augmentation to decide when it is appropriate to use Ferromantic Override. This list is just designed to play some good Conquest. I'm going to say again, middle of the road. This is a 2.5, maybe 3 list. I expect it will do totally well. Whether or not it has a winning record will be down much more to Jeff than the list. The really, really big units of heavies have their own strengths and vulnerabilities, and not every list will be able to play around them. Some lists, however, will. So yeah, solid 2.5 out of 5. Like this list a lot. Our final Spires list is Matthew Wares. Matthew is one of the few players I think that I don't know either by reputation or personally, running a very interesting, very spicy Spires list. This is almost a callback to the kind of list that we saw back in the beginning of 2.0 at things like, I think Adepticon was one of the early Conquest tournaments, where Vanguard clone infiltrators were broken as hell prior to their nerf. That sort of list is still very, very solid, and so this list is, before we get to the spicy third combat group, this list is clones and drones. We have, across 2 groups, we have 2 shooty high clone executors. The first one is an additional neuroreceptors marksman biotic hive version, and the second is just a regular infiltrator variant eagle eye variant. So we've got 2, both are trying to be quite efficient shooters, and indeed both are. I think that's a good layout. If you want to have marksman and infiltrator variant, the way that Matthew has kitted them out works very well. We will have the high clone executor. Now, he might actually be, for all that he is a marksman variant, I think there is a good chance that he's not going to be in the marksman clones. I think there's a good chance he will be in the Vanguard clones because he makes them scoring. So what we are probably going to see here is we have two unsupported unit of Vanguard clones, four units of Force-grown drones, and then 2 units of VCI with high clone executors in them, which frankly is just violent and ruthless. That is high watermark shooting. Before the VCI nerf, this is the kind of list that just those two combat groups could fight and win like whole tournaments. Now that they've been reined back down to reality, they need to actually play as part of a broader plan, but that is super cool, dangerous stuff. The fact that those units are kitted out to win the ranged duel as well, because they have disperse, means that into things like, say, Dweghom really have to concentrate firepower to take those units down, which not every Dweghom list can do. This list would have been busted as hell in like January 20 or February, March 2023. Now it's merely very, very good. But it gets spicy in the third warband. So the third warband is a relatively expensive Mastery of Flesh 2 Flesh Carver Biomancer in a unit of 5 Force-grown drones. Again, doesn't score, but it's a light unit that can fight a bit and support basically what this unit is just tough enough to allow the Biomancer to support the units of Vanguard Clone Infiltrators, and then second unit of Force-grown drones and 2 Abominations. Now, are Abominations good? Not really, no. But if your opponent has been shredded to absolute hell by all of that shooting, then the fact that an Abomination is a movement 10 model that runs up the board and gets into a zone can keep you further and further into the scenario game, which this list needs to do. Because if you look at this list, it is literally 100% like this. There's the marksman clones, and it's otherwise all light regiments. 2 of the light regiments can score, the 2 marksman clone regiments can score. That is only 4 scoring regiments. So the abominations are necessary in this list to round out the scoring requirement. And for that reason, look, abominations, the things have got 10 wounds and defense 3. Are they tough? Absolutely not. Are they dangerous? Not really, they only have 10 attacks. But they're not expensive, and in this list they are scenario pieces. I expect that they will probably make some charges against units engaged by the Force-grown drones. They will finish units off that have been whittled down by the Vanguard clone infiltrators. But mostly what I think they are there for is to shore up an essential requirement, which is the ability to actually capitalize on that early game shooting and win scenario. This list overall would have been like a 4.5 out of 5 back at the beginning of 2.0 when shooting was almost universally overtuned. Now I think this is a really, really cool 3 or 3.5 out of 5. I think it's got a game plan that is unique and interesting and has managed to endure through a series of nerfs, and I'm very curious to see how Matthew does. We'll call this a 3.5 out of 5, but if played well and correctly, this list can hunt big game, it can win on scenario, it has the capacity. I think it's just a little bit fragile, and I wouldn't be surprised if at least one game it runs into something where that fragility ultimately punishes it. But if Matthew is able to dodge or play through those matchups, this list could go all the way. I think it's a 3.5 out of 5, but it's an incredibly cool 3.5 out of 5. Last, and absolutely not least, we have Wardrun. Wardrun are the most numerous faction playing at CanCon, with 6 players who have submitted list at time of recording, and by golly, it is not surprising. Wardrun have seen a transformation over the course of 2023, with the release, frankly, of just 2 incredibly overtuned heavy regiments. The Tontor and Thunder Riders, but especially the Tontor, are just game-winning pieces, and there is basically no individual player skill or decision makes as much of an impact on a small meta as, hey, Jeff bought a Tontor. And Tontors are in abundance throughout these lists. Only one of these 5 lists does not make heavy use of Tontor or Thunder Riders, or both. We have 4 Tontors, a similar number of Thunder Riders, and they are rounded out like that. They are very, very powerful heavies that complement the existing extremely good Wardrun light and medium game, making Wardrun not just a very technically dangerous with complex, powerful rules thanks to the battlecry and chant system, but just also super high quality units. Wardrun were a faction that historically have been balanced by being, you have units that start out maybe with like a high wound count, but not necessarily high defenses, not necessarily durable. So Wardrun were a faction where you had good but not outstanding units that were made outstanding by the chance system that you had to play carefully and well. And that balance was entirely disrupted by the emergence of the Tontor and Thunder Riders, which just start out excellent and become insane with chance. So the high watermark for Woodrune play is very, very high indeed. And I think if I had to pick a faction that is likely to win the event, it is Woodrune. It isn't Woodrune by a huge margin, although actually the fact that there are just more Woodrune players than anything else means that they have the best odds of one of their players winning. And there is some variety in the lists, but across these 6 lists, we will see a great many common themes. Some of the lists are going to be facing different compromises. I'm getting quite tired. Can you tell this recording has been going on for an hour and 50 minutes? But there are a lot of common themes, and I think Woodrune are the faction that there are some pleasing subtleties in how you build these lists, but there is sufficient commonality that the next update from Parabellum almost certainly will try and divvy up some of that mono build, because there's a little bit of a mono build effect at play here that we haven't seen in any of the other factions except maybe city-states, and the sample size is too small there to make a decision. So the first of these lists is Alex Selths. Alex is from Canberra. They're one of our locals. They're an excellent person. And hey, look, it's a chieftain warlord. The chieftain is currently comfortably the best warlord in Woodrune. 5, I think, of these 6 lists have a chieftain warlord. The 6th, however, Monty Moss's list, is a fascinating exception, and I think speaks to Monty's lists as a player, and we will focus more on Monty's lists for that reason. But Shock for the entire army is just mega, mega powerful and always gets super high value, which is why I'm going to keep saying Chieftain Warlord, because he's going to keep being Chieftain Warlords. This is a Mantle of the Devoted Tontor Rider. Mantle of the Devoted Tontors are the most powerful Tontors, and in my opinion, the most powerful single piece in the game at time of recording. That is actually a matter of some discussion, but I've had a number of conversations with some very, very good American and Canadian players where the point of difference really is Mantle of the Devoted is the most powerful artifact in the game. Mantle of the Devoted on Tontor versus Mantle of the Devoted on Thunder Riders. One of those two is the best unit probably in the game, and it's just a question of the nuance in which you prefer. The American players that I've spoken to come down on the side of Mantle of the Devoted on Thunder Riders. In my opinion, the Mantle of the Devoted on Thunder Riders doesn't do anything that Thunder Riders couldn't already do, whereas Mantle of the Devoted on the Tontor is downright transformative and unlocks a new capacity for your army. It is incredibly strong. The triple activation, the extra march, the threat extension, the flexibility. You can do things that are or it's a more powerful version of fluid formation. It's just egregiously strong, and Alex is actually quite out of practice. He's been dragged off to umpteen different cities going and playing Team Yankee and things, but I would be astounded if just with the Tontor and Chieftain they weren't capable of winning multiple games. Nevertheless, that fetch over, we have a unit of 5 Blooded with Aberration. I love this. Aberration is an incredible attachment, giving the regiment lethal demise, with a high wound count and good resolve, and this takes it even further. 5 of those things is nightmarish, admittedly expensive. 3 veterans, just 3 veterans. We were able to fit, so I helped Alex write this list. We were able to fit those veterans in by just scraping and squeaking points around from elsewhere. This is a unit of opportunity, but just by themselves, these 3 veterans with the war battle chant, they might end up just being a unit that sits on a zone somewhere, 180 points, that's okay to pay for, but they can also kind of do a little bit of carry work. They are dangerous enough and well-flattered enough that if they need to, between natively acceptable defense, shock from the chieftain, and then free battle cries war, you can get them up to good defense with good wound count and good resolve, and they can hold their own at a relatively low cost. They are a flexible unit, they add activation count. They're just a little flex in the list, and they're very, very good for that reason. Blooded with a Fiend Hunter. This is an American style play where American players value flank very highly, probably more than I do, but I think in this case it's well warranted. Get that stuff onto the table, get it fighting. Blooded with flank from the Fiend Hunter. We then have the obligatory Tontor. Our second warband is a Thunder Chieftain. Elder Brontoscalps, that's what you take if you don't take Mantle of the Devoted, in a unit of 4 Thunder Riders. So those will be War Thunder Riders. They will be chanting for cleave and +1 defense, which is going to make them, generally speaking, Defense 4, Resolve 4, Hardened 1, 6 wounds that fight like absolute blazes. This unit is a Death Star. It is costed appropriately, but the thing about this list is that it has 2 Death Stars, because the Thunder Rider is one of them, with flank. Why do they have flank? And the Tauntaur is another. Those heavies will arrive on turn 3 and potentially dominate the entire game. Not to leave it at that, the list is then supplemented by super high quality Wardrune shooting in the form of a Predator with Ceaseless Hunt and Marksmanship in a unit of 4 Slingers. Slingers with a Flint Napper are still, for cost, one of the best units in the game at light ranged presence. The only things that let them down are that the Predator is not a medium character, so he can't score, and there is going to be a lot of loose formation at this event. There are tons of things like there are oodles of Fenrir units, there are lots of high clone executor disperse units, but that doesn't matter, they'll all be fighting one another, and this is just one unit, this is just one range unit, it doesn't have to fight those things, it just provides range support, holds alongside the hunting pack for some light pressure, so we have our lights, good range, like this is a strong range unit with the hunting pack in support, then our mediums arrive, veterans, blooded and blooded, plenty of medium presence, and all that stuff has to do is just hold and secure some scenario points until the Death Stars arrive. And once the Death Stars arrive, provided you are even remotely still in the game, it's a more powerful late game presence than even just a regular Older Dominion army has, and that is saying something. Alex, I think, has the potential. This list by itself is an easy 3 or 4 out of 5, but the fact that Alex has been gallivanting around the entire country and will have played perhaps one game with this list in the month before CanCon means I'm going to give this list just a 3 out of 5, accounting for the player rather than the list. But in a vacuum, this list is an easy 4 out of 5 and is one of the lists that could definitely win the event. We will breeze through the next few Wardrune lists because they are repeats on a theme. This is Nicholas Hamanet, I believe, is coming down from Maitland, Newcastle. I know Nicholas, he's an Infinity player and an outstanding person. This list starts with a Predator, Sacred Sensor, excellent artifact, Ceaseless Hunt in, let's find it, yep, there's the unit of 3 Slingers, Hunting Pack, Raptor Riders, and Apex Predator. This is not a ridden Apex Predator. I think that's the right choice. Apex Predators, unless you are very confident with managing threat against them, they are a dangerous but fragile monster regiment. So chucking a Predator onto them, for example, I think is a little bit risky, but they're good just by themselves. Excellent. Chieftain, this is a Mantle of Devoted Thunder Tauntaur Rider Chieftain. This isn't the Warlord, but we'll see the Warlord soon. We have a unit of, yep, 3-blooded with a tracker, and then a Tauntaur Rider. Then we have a Thunder Rider, Warlord, Elder Brontoscalps, Rapid Displacement in a unit of 4 Thunder Riders, and a unit of 3 Braves. Now, this list is very, very powerful, very similar to Alex's list. One of the things to note about this list is that Nicholas is optimizing for something particular, and that is ability to get this painted. Nick is a relatively recent convert to Conquest, and he has banged this army out in, like, I don't know, 5 minutes. It looks awesome. The Apex Predator, like the dinosaurs, there is a reason why Wardrune are popular, and it's not the power of the faction. That's incidental. Wardrune are popular because they look incredible, and he's done an excellent job with this list. I would say it is kind of likely that Alex's list is maybe very, very, very slightly more optimized, but not by any significant margin, and for that reason, I rate this list of Nick's basically exactly the same. The list by itself is a comfortable 4 out of 5. I know Nick is new at the game, but I think he has that dog in him. So let's leave this list at a sort of 3.5, 4 out of 5, because I think Nick is sufficiently ruthless and well-founded as a wargamer generally that I think he's got a good chance of going probably 3 wins, but if he goes more than that, I will not be the least surprised. Up next, we have Hassan Bulan's list, and stop me if you've heard this one, it's Mantle of the Devoted, Tauntaur Rider, Chieftain, Warlord on a Tauntaur. We have a big unit of 5 veterans here, which is very cool. You can afford at that point, once you've taken that many, to justify the champion, which is a powerful unit upgrade. I think in this case takes them up to Clash 6. The other upgrade, I forget which one it's called, I think gives them Flurry, which is probably better if you can afford it, but this is still excellent. We then have the Tauntaur. We've then got a unit, a Scion of Conquest with Conquest 2, Arcane 1, Roar of the Tribe, and 1 Voice, who will be fighting in a unit of 5-blooded with Aberration and a standard bearer. The Scion of Conquest is built entirely around manipulation of the chant sequence. One voice lets him add chant markers to the sequence. Roar of the Tribe lets his regiment once per game just get a free chant for just one token all the way up to any level, which in war means that those blooded once per game for just one token will be able to have the full Fanatic War, which is +1 defense, cleave, and blessed, which is very, very powerful. He is expensive, and so it's going to be a little bit of a question as to, like, that is a 460 point regiment in total, and it ultimately is just 5 stands of blooded, but it's 5 stands of blooded with an aberration, so I'm here for that. We then have a Predator. This is an Apex Master Predator with Death's Reach, Ceaseless Hunt in the Famine Warband. He's riding an Apex Predator, and the rest of his warband is 2 units of Raptor Riders. So this is a high and tight Wardrune list. It's not running much in the way of lighters, like not running much in the way of chaff. Almost every regiment is doing something strong and significant. So what we see here is we don't see any of those American style 150 point flank blooded regiments. It's big blooded regiment, big veterans regiment, Predator on a dinosaur, Chieftain on a dinosaur, and then 2 units of Raptor Riders. So we have that sort of like light early skirmish, but this list is not going to be scoring scenario points until those bricks arrive, the blooded and the veterans. This list, if it was not for the Mantle of the Devoted Tauntaur, I would say this list is at risk of losing the early skirmish and then not necessarily having the best placement to fight its way out with those medium blocks until the dinosaurs arrive. And as good as, like, a Predator on an Apex as an Apex Master is by no means bad, but it's not as strong as a unit of Thunder Riders. However, no doubt this list will look excellent, and I cannot rate any list that has a Mantle of the Devoted Chieftain Warlord Thunder Rider as any less than a 3. So this is super interesting. I think it'd be very cool to play against. This is probably the closest we have seen to a fair Wardrune list that's just doing some like good solid stuff and also has that freaking Tauntaur. So we're going to give this list a 3 out of 5, which again, reminder, is a winning record. I would be surprised if this list did not come out ahead of the pack, but I'm not sure it's a full tournament winner. We then have James Barton's list, and say it with me, it's a Chieftain, Warlord, Tauntaur Rider riding a Tauntaur. Notably absent here is the Mantle of the Devoted, and to be perfectly frank, I think, James, if you're ever thinking about tinkering with this list, you should get yourself a Mantle of the Devoted and put it on that Tauntaur. The Mantle of the Devoted appears nowhere in this list, and it is probably the most powerful artifact in the entire game. It's incredibly strong, especially for its points cost. There is no reason for that Chieftain not to have one. Still, doesn't have one. We have a unit of 3 blooded with Aberration and the Tauntaur. We then have an expensive Matriarch Queen, War, Death's Gaze, Wasteland Adler, and Conquest 1 in a medium-sized unit of Braves. Standard Bearer, Champion, 6 of those for 250 points. This is not a big block of Braves, but it's pretty big. They're a solid regiment, and she will serve them well, particularly with her healing. We then have Warbred and Raptor Riders, and a Ceaseless Hunt Marksmanship Predator in a unit of Hunters with a Skirmisher, Hunting Pack, and Apex Predator. The Apex Predator, again, is unridden. I think that's the best, probably the best configuration for it. This list, look, to be perfectly frank, with the exception of the Chieftain, Tauntaur Rider, Tauntaur, Warlord, this list is a starter box Wardrune army. I bought a whole bunch of Wardrune back in 2002 because the models were all awesome, and it turns out that the list has aged super well. All it took to modernize this list is the Tauntaur, and the Tauntaur means this list is modern. The fact that you have not put the Mantle of the Devoted on the Chieftain, I think, is I'm not going to say unforgivable, but you would significantly increase the threat, power, and winning potential of this list with that Mantle of the Devoted. And if this list had been submitted and it was 1,975 points, I'd be like, oh, it's obvious, he's just forgotten. But it's 2000 out of 2000. Clearly, he has chosen not to take it. I would strongly, strongly recommend it. There is no other, the entire rest of the list, nothing else in the rest of the list will do as much for 25 points as Mantle of the Devoted would. But hey, it's a Chieftain, Thunder Rider, Tauntaur. We're going to give this one a perfect middle of the road, 2.5 out of 5. It is very, very much a starter box army that we've stapled the Tauntaur to, and without Mantle of the Devoted, a Tauntaur is much closer to fair. It doesn't zip around the battlefield like it's on skates, doing everything, killing everything, and being very difficult to stop or play around. It's a speed 6 monster, and it feels much, much more fair when a speed 6 monster is actually moving speed 6 rather than moving 20 something inches in a turn because of the power of the Conquest 3 chant. So we're going to give this list a clean 2.5 out of 5. This is the circumstance in which a Tauntaur is much, much closer to balanced without the triple activation Omega threat. I think this list will do totally serviceably. I would expect it to maybe have a winning record or maybe not. It's a wonderful list. I hope James has a good time. This is a list to have a good time with because it's doing a lot of different things and just a little bit of a lot of different things. Up next, we have new Wardrune list submitted by Mark Williams, and this is the first of two lists that does not have either a Tauntaur Rider or a Chieftain Warlord, but it does have Thunder Riders, which again, they're a good unit. Why would you not take Thunder Riders? This list is, along with Monty's, which is the last list that we'll look at, this is a Matriarch Queen Warlord list. And although the sheer value and ease of use of the Chieftain Warlord, I think, makes it the best Warlord in Wardrune, the Matriarch Queen remains the thinking man's choice. Fanatic is an incredible, powerful ability. We just spent some time talking about how the Mantle of the Devoted was probably the best artifact in the game, and the Matriarch Queen has capacity to hand out Fanatic as a rule 2 units, which means that if you have a grip on how Wardrune play, you have an incredibly powerful ability on tap. Now, in Mark's list, we have her riding an Apex. I am not sure that's the best idea because it means that she's fragile, but the logic of it, I presume, is that the Apex Predator is fast, and by being fast, you can get that Matriarch Queen around and use those powerful draw events in order to basically run it as a very quick predatory buff creature, in addition to the fact that it will punch and fight very, very well. I would be very curious to see how that plays. Without seeing it in practice, I don't have capacity to really evaluate that. But the ability to place her buffs off that large base, off that very fast large base, has potential. We have a unit of 3 Warbred as the rest of her warband, then we move on to a Chieftain. This is a rare foot chieftain, but it does have Mantle of the Devoted in the Famine Warband, and it will very, very likely be fighting in those Braves. The reason why is that Fanatic on Veterans has some Scornergy with their Forged in Battle, where they get the little free warband. So the Veterans, I assume, would be fighting by themselves with Standard Bearer and Chief. The Braves, we have big unit of Braves with a champion that we can pop Famine into. Combat 1, Combat 2, Combat 3, Violence of Action, which gives the whole regiment flurry. This is a punchy, dangerous Brave list that needs only one chant to get to full Tier 3 Famine and do potentially a great deal of damage. Famine is a warband that you don't see particularly often if you are running a Chieftain Warlord, because the first tier of Famine gives you +2 charge inches and the shock rule, which Chieftain already gives you. But in this list, where we have a Matriarch Queen Warlord, Famine turns that unit of Braves, particularly Tier 3 Fanatic Famine, turns that unit of Braves into cavalry, into like kind of dangerous cavalry, which is very cool, very interesting to see, and it's something that's not just trying to make use of the Tauntaur. I'm here for this a lot. From there, we have a unit of 3 Thunder Riders, and again, this is in a Famine Warband, because we are not playing them in a Chieftain Warlord Warband where they would get shock automatically for free without having to do anything, thanks to the Supremacy. In that environment, you will generally want War Thunder Riders, because increasing the defense and giving them cleave is very, very good. But when they aren't being given shock automatically by a Chieftain, Famine is a great choice for them, and there's nothing wrong with any of the other buffs that it gives. Warband 3, we then have a Predator. He's running basically nothing, just Ceaseless Hunt. He's a very, very cheap 90-point Predator. He will be fighting in a unit of 3 Hunters with a Tracker. We have a unit of 3 Blooders with a Tracker, Blooded with a Tracker to get onto the field early, and then Raptor Riders. This list it feels very much like this is fair Wardrune, but that's kind of illusory. Yes, it only has the 3 Thunder Riders, and they're not being given the like grotesque force multiplications. Yes, it's got otherwise basically just like a really well-rounded selection of regiments, and nothing leaps out as being ridiculously over the top. There's no individual piece that you're like, that doesn't seem fair, that's just overstated. But what this is doing is this is all working together very, very well. And this is a theme that we will see repeated in Monty's list, which we'll look at in a moment, and last up. This is a list that is built to just play good Conquest. It's going to give Mark a great deal of choice, a great deal of flexibility, and unlike, say, a Thunder Rider list, unlike, say, a Tauntaur list, where all you are doing is getting to Conquest Tier 3 and then thundering across the table and relying on your just incredible mechanical strength, this list is hugely contingent on actually being able to maximize the use of Wardrune chance. And if Mark is able to play this list, fully engaging with the Wardrune mechanics, fully making use of the different warbands that he's taken and he's got the different warband cults, then this list has incredible potential. But this is a list that is going to be down to Mark's skill as a player. But the fact that he's written the list that way suggests to me that he's probably pretty confident, and I think he's got reason to do so. For that reason, we're going to give him a 3.5 out of 5 for this list. It is a list that isn't just likely, I think this list is likely, highly likely to have a winning record, and any list that can get to 3.5 on this scale can comfortably get to the finals. So excellent list from Mark, and we're going to see some of these themes repeated in the final list of today, Monty's list. Now, Monty is the person who won CanCon in 2023. I think that was the first year that Conquest was run at CanCon, and Monty went all the way to the finals and took home the Golden Fish Gnome. This list is a thing of cruel beauty, and the reason why this list is a thing of cruel beauty is that if you recall the discussion of the Nords lists, Monty has grudged Ewan, and Ewan has accepted, which means that that list that's full of defense 2, Ugur, and evasion 2, Fenrir, has to play into this abomination that Monty has written. Now, we do have a Chieftain Warlord here. This is a Chieftain Tontor Rider Warlord, so this is the 5th Tontor Rider that we've seen. But notably, no Mantle of the Devoted, it's just a regular Tontor Rider, and because there's no Mantle of the Devoted to give the Tontor Rider the ability to cross 1,000,000 miles in a single blink, we have rapid displacement to get it up the field. We then have, and this is going to be a theme, 3-blooded with an aberration, and then 3-blooded with an aberration, and then 3-blooded with an aberration, then an Apex Rider Matriarch Queen with 3-blooded with an aberration and an Apex Predator. We then have a second Matriarch Queen. She has Mantle of the Voted. She's chanting War in a unit of Braves. Famine would also have been a great choice here, but with 8 Braves rather than 6. Technically, Famine scales up very well with the impact attacks, but here I think we're looking to play these units as an anvil. The Braves are an excellent choice, like 8 Braves with their support attacks being given +1 defense, cleave, and blessed. Very, very good choice. This is a unit that will go the distance, and this is kind of like, this is classic stuff. This is an anvil this is when Wardroom players talk about a big block of Braves from back in like version 1.5. This is what they were talking about. This is good stuff, and an Apex Predator. Now, interesting to note that there is no variation in the warband cults across this list. It is war, 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 which means that Monty is going to have a very easy time getting absolutely maximal use out of the higher tier chance if he wants to. But look, really, the story that's being told here is Monty has geared up to annihilate poor Ewan because 60 wounds of lethal demise troops is just, it's actually just possible that mechanically that Nord list can't beat that. I think it's probably not that bad, but Monty has done a cruel thing to his friend here. And Monty, like, you owe Ewan a drink. Frankly, you owe Ewan dinner first before this game. You guys should catch up on the day before the event, and you should buy Ewan dinner because of what you're about to do to him is usually precluded by a candlelight. This list is excellent. Perhaps slightly less so than Mark's list. Mark's list, which we just spoke about, I would describe as built to play good Conquest in a way that is more technical than Monty's. Monty's list is more mechanical and less technical. It is not trying to overcomplicate things. This list is playing good Conquest in the way, not that Wardrune are a faction of complicated mechanics. This list is playing Hammer, Anvil, Maneuver. This list will be made or broken. Well, actually, frankly, sometimes you can just lethal demise your way through entire games. But otherwise, this list will be made or broken by Maneuver. Classic rank and flank. And Monty won the event last year, which means we know he has the chops. For that reason, giving this list a comfortable 4 out of 5. I think mechanically you could make it slightly more disgusting, but this is one of the very few times where the Mantle of Devoted being taken off the Tontor and put somewhere else, Shock Assault compensates for it. Not entirely, in fact, not even close to entirely, but somewhat. And that Mantle Devoted big block of Braves, you can see that there is some comfort there for Monty. He knows how to play that. This entire list screams, I know how to play this. It exudes confidence, and I would not be surprised to see Monty playing in the final. So for that reason, we're giving him a comfortable 4 out of 5, rounding out the list review. Now, that is only 25 lists, and I believe we have, or 26, we have 30 registered players for CanCon, but of course, naughty naughty, some players have not submitted their list in time. Nevertheless, it gives us a good feeling for what's going to be happening at the event, and with the exception of a fair bit of mono build happening in the Wardrune space, I think it's kind of illuminating that there is so much list variety at play in almost all of the other factions. It's been a long time. Like, there are some game systems that manage to have that level of variety consistently, and being able to achieve that in Conquest's second edition, relatively early in its life cycle. The game is 5 years old, technically speaking, but I think we can consider it a young game. That's a serious accomplishment. So, props to the Australian community for coming up with some wide and varied lists. They will almost certainly have wide and varied performance, but again, CanCon is a meeting of metas. It'll be very cool to see what rises to the top and what doesn't. For those interested in catching up, I of course will be at CanCon. I will be playing. I hope to see and look forward to seeing some people there, putting some names to faces in particular. And that concludes this extremely long 2 hour and 15-minute CanCon list review. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description. Otherwise, I will get this uploaded shortly and we will have timestamps for each of the factions. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you either next time or at CanCon.